You've been taught that control keeps you safe, that planning everything, holding everything together, staying one step ahead is what prevents life from falling apart. But if that were true, why are you still exhausted? Why does your mind refuse to rest? Why do you lie awake at night replaying conversations, imagining outcomes, trying to fix a future that hasn't arrived yet? The truth is simple and uncomfortable at the same time. Control doesn't bring peace, it delays it. Buddhist wisdom has been quietly pointing to this for thousands of years, not through force or motivation or positive thinking, but through understanding, the kind that softens the grip of the mind and allows life to move without resistance. The Buddha didn't teach how to dominate your thoughts. He taught how to stop fighting them, how to release the constant need to manage, explain, predict, and hold everything together. Tonight, as you listen, your breathing will slow, your body will grow heavier, the tension you didn't even realize you were carrying will begin to loosen. Thoughts may still arise, but they won't demand your attention. They won't pull you into effort or struggle. You don't need to fix anything. You don't need to become anything. You don't need to let go on purpose. Rest arrives on its own. Peace shows up without effort. Sleep takes you gently the moment you stop trying to control it. This isn't about doing less or escaping life. It's about allowing life to live through you without resistance. This is not just something to fall asleep to, it's an unlearning, a quiet return to the ease that was never missing. Are you ready? Let's begin. The words you just heard don't end when the introduction ends. They continue quietly, like an echo that stays in the room after the sound has passed. Something has already begun to soften, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for the mind to pause and wonder if the way it has been holding everything is really necessary. This is where the deeper listening starts, not with effort, but with a subtle shift away from trying to control what comes next. There is a strange pressure most people carry without realizing it, a feeling that everything depends on them, that every thought, every action, every outcome is somehow authored by a solid me sitting at the center of life, pulling levers, making things happen, trying to get it right. This belief feels so normal that it's rarely questioned. It feels responsible, mature, even moral, but beneath it lives a quiet tension, a constant background stress that says, I am the one who must do this correctly, or else. Buddhism gently questions this assumption, not to confuse you, not to take anything away, but to relieve a weight you may have been carrying for years. It starts with something very simple and very unsettling. The idea that there is a single, independent doer behind actions may not be true in the way you think it is. Actions happen, words are spoken, decisions appear. But when you look closely, very closely, where is the solid author of all this? Where is the separate controller who stands apart from life and directs it? Buddhism calls this belief the illusion of the doer, the sense that there is a permanent agent behind experience. And it is this belief, more than almost anything else, that feeds anxiety, pride, guilt, and exhaustion. Anxiety often comes from feeling personally responsible for outcomes that are far bigger than you. You think, I have to make this work, I have to say the right thing, I have to choose correctly. Pride comes from believing, I did this. This success proves something about me. Guilt comes from the flip side. I failed. I should have done better. This is on me. All of them assume the same thing, that there is a central owner of action who could have acted differently if only they were better, smarter, calmer, more disciplined. Buddhism doesn't deny action. It doesn't deny effort. It doesn't say nothing matters. What it questions is ownership. It asks you to look at how actions actually arise, A thought appears, an intention forms, the body moves, words come out. But none of these arise in isolation. They depend on countless conditions, past experiences, habits, moods, upbringing, biology, culture, the tone of a conversation, the time of day, even how well you slept last night. When you speak, did you invent the language? When you react, did you choose your nervous system? When you decide, did you design the preferences that shape that decision? Even your ability to choose depends on conditions you did not choose. This doesn't make you powerless. It makes you human, and more importantly, it makes you less alone in carrying the burden of authorship. The sense of being the doer is not something you consciously decided to believe. It was absorbed early. As a child, you were praised or blamed as if you were a small, independent commander. You did well. You shouldn't have done that. Over time, this solidified into an inner voice that keeps score. It tracks mistakes. It claims credit. It worries about future judgments. It says, "This is me, and this is what I do." Buddhism invites you to notice something radical. Actions happen, but the idea of a separate doer is added afterward. It's a story layered on top of experience. First there is movement, speech, thought. Then comes the thought, "I did this." That thought feels obvious, but it is still a thought. It is not the action itself. When this is seen clearly, something begins to loosen. Anxiety softens because you are no longer carrying the entire future on your shoulders. You still care. You still respond. But you are not pretending to be the sole cause of everything that happens. Life becomes something you participate in, not something you must control from the center. This is where many people misunderstand the teaching. They think, if there is no doer, then nothing matters. But Buddhism does not replace responsibility with apathy. It replaces ownership with responsiveness. You still act, but without the extra layer of self-blame or self-congratulation. You do what is appropriate to the moment, based on conditions, and then you let the moment pass. This shift is deeply relieving. Guilt loses its sharp edge. You can acknowledge harm without drowning in self-hatred. You can learn without punishing yourself. Pride also softens. Success no longer has to prove your worth. It can simply be appreciated as something that arose through many causes, including effort, but not owned like a trophy that defines who you are. There is also a quiet humility that comes with this understanding, not the heavy kind that puts you down, but a light kind that frees you from constantly defending an identity. You no longer need to maintain the image of being the one who always knows, always decides correctly, always has control. You can be more honest, more flexible, more open to change. At a deeper level, the illusion of the doer is closely tied to tension in the body. Notice how often the body tightens around the thought, "I have to do this." Shoulders lift, jaw clenches, breath becomes shallow. This is not accidental. The belief in a central controller creates physical contraction. When that belief is questioned, the body often responds with a sense of relief, sometimes before the mind fully understands why. Buddhist practice doesn't ask you to force yourself to believe there is no doer. That would just be another form of control. Instead, it asks you to observe. Watch how intentions arise. Notice how actions unfold. See how often things happen without a clear commander giving orders. Even something as simple as breathing continues without your supervision. Digestion happens, the heart beats, thoughts appear and disappear. When you sit quietly, you may notice that the thought, "I am choosing this thought," usually comes after the thought has already appeared. The mind takes credit retroactively. Seeing this again and again gently undermines the idea of a central author, not through argument, but through direct experience. As this understanding deepens, life starts to feel less like a performance and more like a flow. You still show up, you still care, but you are no longer carrying the extra burden of needing every action to define you. Mistakes become part of learning, not evidence of a flawed self. Success becomes something to enjoy, not something to cling to. This also changes how you relate to others. When you see that actions arise from conditions, compassion grows naturally. You begin to understand that others, too, are responding from their conditioning, their pain, their history. This doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior, but it does mean you stop taking everything personally. The sharp edges of resentment soften. The need to constantly judge relaxes. Perhaps the most subtle freedom here is the relief from constant self-monitoring. When you believe you are the doer, you are always watching yourself. Am I doing this right? How do I look? What will this say about me? When that belief loosens, attention can return to the moment itself. Listening becomes deeper. Action becomes simpler. There is less commentary running in the background. Over time, this understanding creates a different relationship with effort. Effort is no longer driven by fear of being wrong or inadequate. It becomes a natural response to what matters. You act because the situation calls for it, not because you are trying to secure an identity or avoid blame. This kind of effort is quieter, more sustainable, and far less exhausting. There is also a strange peace that comes from realizing you don't have to carry your entire past as a personal burden. So much guilt comes from replaying old actions and thinking, I should have known better. But at the time you acted from the conditions that were present then, not the wisdom you have now. Seeing this doesn't erase responsibility, but it does replace cruelty with understanding. The illusion of the doer keeps you trapped in time, constantly judging the past and worrying about the future. When it loosens, attention naturally settles more in the present. Not because you force it to, but because there is less need to mentally rewrite what has already happened or control what hasn't arrived. This is why this teaching is so deeply connected to rest and sleep. The mind that believes it must author everything never truly rests. Even in bed, it is still planning, fixing, rehearsing. When the sense of authorship softens, the mind can finally stand down. Not because you told it to, but because it no longer feels solely responsible for holding reality together. Nothing mystical needs to happen. No special state is required. Just a gentle noticing that life is already moving, already responding, already unfolding through countless conditions. You are part of that movement, not its isolated source. And in seeing that, something ancient and tired inside you can finally relax. This understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It settles gradually, like dust falling after the room has been disturbed. Each time you notice action without ownership, reaction without a fixed self behind it, the grip loosens a little more. And with each loosening, anxiety has less to hold on to, pride has less to defend, guilt has less to punish. What remains is not emptiness in a frightening sense, but space. Space to act without fear, space to rest without guilt, space to let life be as it is without the constant pressure of needing to be its author. As the weight of personal authorship begins to loosen, something quieter but just as powerful starts to reveal itself. When you are no longer trying to be the sole cause behind every action, a deeper question naturally arises. If there is no isolated doer pulling the strings, then how does life actually move? What shapes each moment? What carries things forward when the pressure of control softens? This is where another hidden tension often lives. The belief that if everything depends on conditions, then freedom must be lost. Buddhism turns this belief completely upside down. There is an emotional charge tied to the word dependence. It often sounds like weakness, like being trapped, like not being in control of your own life. Many people secretly fear that if they accept conditionality, they are admitting defeat, surrendering agency, or giving in to fate. But this fear itself comes from the same misunderstanding that created the illusion of the doer. It assumes freedom only exists when nothing influences you. Buddhism points to a very different kind of freedom, one that emerges precisely because everything is influenced. Dependent origination is one of the most central teachings in Buddhism. Yet it is often misunderstood as a cold explanation of cause and effect, as if life were a mechanical chain where nothing could ever change. In truth, it is one of the most relieving insights the tradition offers. It says that nothing stands alone. No feeling, no action, no thought, no event arises by itself. Everything comes into being because conditions support it. And because conditions can change, so can experience. The feeling that life is a personal burden often comes from believing you are the final link in every chain, that everything rests on your shoulders, that if you don't get it right, the whole structure collapses. Conditionality dissolves this pressure. It reveals that you are part of a vast web of influences, not its manager. Life doesn't ask you to carry it. It moves through countless supports, many of which you don't see and don't control. This understanding shifts how responsibility is felt in the body. Instead of feeling like a heavy obligation, responsibility becomes responsiveness. You respond to conditions as they are, rather than blaming yourself for conditions that already exist. This is a subtle but profound difference. Blame looks backward and tightens. Responsiveness looks present and opens. Many people confuse dependent origination with destiny. They hear everything is conditioned and think it means nothing can be different. Buddhism says the opposite. Because things are conditioned, they are flexible. If something were fixed, independent and self-created, it would be stuck. Change would be impossible. Conditionality is what allows growth, healing, learning, and release. Consider how emotions work. A feeling does not appear out of nowhere. It arises because of thoughts, memories, body sensations, environment, and past experiences. When you believe the emotion is purely yours, a personal flaw or failure, it becomes heavy and sticky. When you see it as conditioned, something softens. You can ask what is feeding it rather than judging yourself for having it. This removes a huge amount of unnecessary self-criticism. Instead of saying, "Why am I like this?" the question becomes, "What is happening right now that gives rise to this?" That shift alone can transform how you relate to anxiety, sadness, anger, and even joy. You stop treating emotions as verdicts about who you are and start seeing them as processes that can change. Conditionality also frees you from over-responsibility for others. Many people carry a quiet belief that they must fix, save, or manage the emotional states of those around them. When someone else is upset, they feel it as a personal failure. Dependent origination reveals that other people's experiences arise from conditions far beyond you. You can influence, support, and care, but you are not the sole cause of another person's happiness or suffering. This doesn't make you indifferent. It makes compassion more honest. You help without the hidden demand that your help must work. You care without turning care into control. You offer presence rather than solutions. This kind of compassion is lighter, cleaner, and less exhausting. There is also a deep relief in seeing that your past does not define you in a fixed way. Your habits, tendencies, and patterns exist because of past conditions. They are not permanent traits carved into your identity. When the conditions change, the patterns can change. This understanding removes the sense of being trapped by who you have been. Many people live as if their current struggles are proof that something is wrong with them at the core. Buddhism gently reframes this. It says struggle is the natural result of certain conditions being present. When those conditions are understood and softened, struggle eases. No condemnation is required. No harsh self-improvement campaign is needed. Even the idea of effort changes under this light. Instead of forcing change through willpower alone, effort becomes about adjusting conditions. You change what you feed the mind. You change how you relate to thoughts. You change your environment, your routines, your attention. Change happens not because you dominate yourself, but because the causes that sustain suffering lose their support. This is why dependent origination is deeply practical, not abstract. It shows you where real leverage exists, not in blaming yourself and not in fantasizing about total control, but in understanding what supports each experience. When something painful arises, you don't ask how to eliminate it instantly. You ask what keeps it going. This approach also brings humility in a healthy way. Success is no longer a reason for arrogance because you see how many conditions made it possible. Failure is no longer a reason for shame because you see how many conditions contributed to it. Life becomes less personal and more intimate at the same time. There is a quiet dignity in this view. You are neither a powerless victim nor an all-powerful controller. You are a participant in an ongoing process. You influence and are influenced. You shape and are shaped. And this balance removes the extreme pressure of needing to be more than human. Conditionality also changes how time is experienced. When you believe everything depends on you, the future feels like a threat that must be managed. When you understand dependent origination, the future becomes a field of changing conditions. You prepare where you can, respond when needed, and rest when nothing is required. There is less mental rehearsal, less catastrophic planning. This is especially important at night, when the mind often reviews the day and anticipates tomorrow. Over-responsibility keeps the nervous system alert. Conditionality allows it to stand down. It reminds the system that life will continue moving even when you sleep, that not everything needs to be solved before rest is allowed. There is also freedom in realizing that clarity itself arises from conditions. You don't need to force insight. When the mind is quiet, when pressure is reduced, when the body feels safe, understanding appears naturally. Trying to control understanding often delays it. Allowing the conditions for clarity is far more effective. This teaching also removes the harsh division between right and wrong that many people carry inside. Instead of seeing actions as purely good or bad, they are seen as skillful or unskillful responses to conditions. This allows learning without self-punishment. You adjust, refine, and grow without turning every mistake into an identity. Even motivation changes under this lens. You don't act because you should or because you fear consequences. You act because certain values and understandings are present. When those values weaken, forcing motivation rarely works, adjusting conditions does. Dependent origination also explains why forcing peace never works. Peace arises when the causes of agitation are no longer fed. You don't create peace by command. You allow it by removing what disturbs it. This makes peace feel natural rather than fragile. There is something deeply comforting about realizing that life is held by more than your effort. That even when you don't know what to do, conditions are still shifting, possibilities are still forming, and nothing is as stuck as it appears. This comfort is not passive. It is grounded in understanding. When this view settles, trust begins to replace control. Not blind trust, but informed trust. Trust in the fact that life responds to conditions and that you can participate wisely without carrying everything alone. This trust calms the nervous system in a way no amount of planning ever could. Conditionality also brings patience. When you see how change actually happens, you stop demanding instant results. You respect the pace of transformation. You allow things to unfold without rushing or resisting. This patience is not resignation, it is alignment with how life actually works. There is also a quiet sense of belonging that arises here. You are no longer standing apart from the world, trying to manage it. You are inside it, moving with it. This dissolves the subtle loneliness that often comes from believing you must handle everything yourself. As this understanding deepens, control begins to feel unnecessary rather than virtuous. You still act, you still care, but the constant pressure to manage every outcome fades. What remains is a steady, responsive presence that meets life as it arrives. And in this presence, the mind finds rest, not because everything is resolved, but because it no longer believes it must resolve everything. As the sense of being solely responsible for life softens, and as the pressure to manage every condition begins to fade, a new temptation quietly appears. It sounds wise, it sounds spiritual, it even sounds peaceful. The mind says, "I will let go now," and without realizing it, control puts on a softer mask. There is a subtle emotional tension hidden inside the desire to surrender, a quiet urgency, a hope that if you do this correctly, something uncomfortable will finally stop. This is where many sincere seekers get stuck, not because they are doing something wrong, but because the mind has learned how to turn even release into a task. And tasks, no matter how gentle they sound, still carry effort, pressure, and expectation. Letting go fails the moment it becomes a strategy. Not because letting go is wrong, but because strategies are built on the assumption that someone is still in charge of making something happen. The language may change, the intention may feel softer, but the structure remains the same. There is still a controller trying to reach a better state. This often shows up as silent self-instruction. Relax. Stop thinking. Release this feeling. On the surface, these phrases sound harmless, but underneath them is resistance. They imply that what is present right now is not acceptable and must be changed. And the mind feels this contradiction immediately. It tightens even as it pretends to loosen. Genuine release does not arrive through command. It arrives when resistance runs out of energy. When something is fully allowed to be there without a plan to remove it, it begins to change on its own. This is not magic. It is the natural behavior of experience when it is no longer being pushed against. Many people approach letting go the same way they approach problem solving. They look for the right method, the right mindset, the right inner posture. But this search itself is fueled by discomfort. It is driven by the hope that relief can be engineered. Buddhism points out something quietly radical here. Relief is not produced. It happens when production stops. This is deeply uncomfortable for a mind that has been trained to improve, optimize, and manage. The mind asks, "If I don't do something, nothing will change." But the mind forgets how often change happens without effort. Moods shift, thoughts pass, sensations dissolve. None of this requires instruction. The problem is not effort itself. The problem is effort aimed at eliminating experience. When you try to let go of fear because you don't want to feel fear, fear feels rejected. Rejection strengthens what is rejected. The nervous system reads it as danger and tightens further. Letting go becomes effortless only when there is nothing left to prove and nothing left to escape. This is why the attempt to surrender often feels frustrating. The mind wants a result: peace, calm, clarity. But results belong to control. The moment a result is expected, surrender collapses into another form of striving. This doesn't mean you should stop practicing or stop caring. It means practice changes direction. Instead of trying to drop experience, you allow it to be fully present. Instead of managing the mind, you listen to it. Instead of demanding peace, you make space for unrest. This shift is subtle and deeply counterintuitive. It feels like doing less, but it is actually doing something much more honest. It is removing the hidden violence of self-correction, the quiet message that says you shouldn't feel this way. When surrender becomes genuine, it doesn't feel like an achievement. It feels like relief without effort. Often it arrives after exhaustion, after the mind has tried every technique and realized none of them can force peace. In that moment, something drops not because you chose to drop it, but because there is nothing left to hold it with. This is why people sometimes experience sudden calm after crying, after giving up, after admitting they don't know what to do. It's not the emotion that brings peace. It's the end of resistance. The system stops fighting itself. Trying to let go too early often backfires. The mind uses the idea of letting go to bypass what it doesn't want to feel. This creates a split. One part tries to be calm, another part feels ignored. The ignored part grows louder, and the person concludes they are bad at letting go. Buddhism doesn't teach you to drop experience. It teaches you to see clearly, and clarity naturally loosens grip. When something is fully seen without judgment, it doesn't need to be held or pushed away. It completes itself. This is why genuine release feels unintentional. You don't decide it's time. It happens when understanding ripens, when the system recognizes on its own that holding on is no longer necessary. Trying to schedule this recognition only delays it. Even the desire to be free can become a chain. The mind says, once I let go, I will finally be okay. This places freedom in the future and turns the present into a problem. Peace cannot arrive in a present moment that is treated as a mistake. The irony is painful and simple. Wanting to let go is often the very thing preventing it. Because wanting implies lack. It implies something essential is missing, and the system tightens around that belief. When letting go stops being a goal, it becomes a byproduct, a side effect of seeing things as they are. You stop asking, how do I release this? And start noticing how it already changes when not interfered with. This is especially important with emotions. Emotions have their own intelligence. They rise, peak, and fall when given space. When you try to drop them prematurely, they linger. When you let them complete their cycle, they move on naturally. Control disguised as surrender often shows up as spiritual language. Words like acceptance, detachment, presence. These words are not the problem. The problem is using them to suppress. True acceptance has no tension in it. It does not lean forward. It does not wait for improvement. A simple way to sense the difference is to feel the body. Strategic letting go carries subtle effort. There is a holding pattern. Genuine release feels like exhale without intention. The body softens on its own. This also changes how you relate to meditation and rest. Instead of using them as tools to fix yourself, they become spaces where nothing needs to be fixed. This is when they actually work. Letting go fails as a strategy because strategies belong to the part of the mind that believes it must manage life. Genuine release occurs when that belief is no longer being fed. When the mind sees that control has limits and those limits are not dangerous. There is a deep trust that begins to form here. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in process. Trust that experience knows how to move when not restrained. Trust that you don't have to supervise every inner movement. This trust cannot be forced. It grows slowly, through repeated noticing. Through seeing again and again that what you allow tends to pass, and what you fight tends to stay. Over time, this understanding changes your relationship with effort altogether. Effort becomes situational, not personal. You act when action is needed. You rest when rest is needed. You don't try to surrender. You simply stop interfering. And in that non-interference, something deeply human relaxes. The endless project of self-management pauses. The nervous system feels less threatened. Sleep arrives more easily. Thoughts lose their urgency. This is not because you finally learned how to let go correctly. It's because you stopped trying to let go at all. And in that stopping, release happened quietly, without instruction, without strategy, without anyone claiming credit for it. When effort finally loosens its grip and release happens without being forced, another pattern often reveals itself underneath. It is quieter than control, more socially accepted, and often praised as healthy. It sounds like growth, it sounds like discipline, it sounds like becoming better. Yet beneath it, there is often a subtle aggression turned inward, a constant message that who you are right now is not enough. There is an emotional weight carried by the belief that life is a project and the self is something that must be improved. This belief rarely feels violent on the surface. It disguises itself as motivation, ambition, or responsibility. But when looked at closely, it often rests on dissatisfaction with what already exists. The moment you believe you must be better in order to be at peace, the present becomes something to escape. Buddhism does not oppose growth, learning, or refinement. What it questions is the force behind the desire to improve. When improvement is driven by rejection of the present self, it becomes a form of self-harm disguised as virtue. The mind may say, "I want to grow," but the body often hears, "You are not acceptable as you are." This creates a quiet background tension. Even when progress is made, relief is temporary. The goalpost moves. There is always another flaw to fix, another habit to correct, another version of yourself to become. Peace is postponed, rest is delayed. Life becomes an endless rehearsal for a future that never fully arrives. Self-optimization culture feeds this pattern relentlessly. It teaches that everything can and should be improved: productivity, emotions, relationships, even rest. Underneath this message is an unspoken assumption that something is fundamentally wrong with being human as you are. That natural rhythms are inefficiencies, that stillness is laziness, that contentment is complacency. Buddhism quietly rejects this entire framework. It does not ask you to polish the self. It asks you to see through the idea of a self that needs polishing. The Dharma does not start from deficiency. It starts from clarity, and clarity does not require self-attack to function. The violence of improvement shows itself most clearly in how people relate to their inner states. Sadness becomes something to fix, fear becomes something to eliminate, anger becomes a failure of character. The mind turns into a battlefield where every unwanted feeling is an enemy. This constant internal war drains enormous energy. When you strive to be better, there is often an internal timeline. Once I change this, then I can relax. But the relaxation never fully comes, because the habit of striving has already become the identity. Even peace becomes something to achieve, and achievement always implies pressure. This striving subtly reinforces separation. There is a version of you who is wrong and a version who would be acceptable. You stand in judgment of yourself, measuring, correcting, monitoring. This split creates tension even when you appear calm on the surface. The nervous system never fully feels safe because it is always under evaluation. The Dharma points to a different starting point. It begins with seeing things as they are without demanding they become something else first. This is not passivity, it is honesty. And honesty is far less exhausting than constant self-surveillance. When improvement is driven by fear, shame, or comparison, it creates resistance in the body. The shoulders tighten, the breath shortens, the mind becomes rigid. This rigidity is the opposite of wisdom. Wisdom is flexible. It adapts, it listens, it does not force. There is also a moral layer to self-optimization that is rarely questioned. People begin to equate worth with performance. Being calm becomes good. Being anxious becomes bad. Being disciplined becomes superior. Being tired becomes failure. This moralization of inner states creates guilt around being human. Buddhism does not rank experiences in this way. It does not say calm is virtuous and agitation is sinful. It says both arise due to conditions, both can be understood, both can pass. The problem begins when one is used as evidence of worth and the other as proof of inadequacy. Striving to be better also interferes with genuine compassion. When you are harsh with yourself, that harshness leaks outward. Even kindness becomes conditional. You offer understanding only after someone has improved, apologized, or changed. This mirrors how you treat yourself. When the drive to improve softens, compassion becomes more natural. You stop needing people, including yourself, to be different before care is allowed. This creates a gentler inner climate, one where growth can happen without force. There is a deep misunderstanding that acceptance means stagnation. Many fear that if they stop pushing themselves, they will stop growing. But the opposite is often true. Growth that comes from understanding is more stable than growth driven by pressure. When the soil is healthy, plants grow without being pulled. The violence of improvement also shows up in spiritual practice. Meditation becomes another tool for self-correction. Awareness is used to judge progress. Stillness becomes a benchmark. The mind asks, "Am I doing this right?" even in moments meant for rest. This turns practice into performance. The body senses this immediately and tightens. The very space meant to be freeing becomes another arena for self-criticism. Buddhism continually points back to simplicity. Sit, observe, allow. No applause is needed. The urge to improve often comes from discomfort with uncertainty. If you can become better, stronger, calmer, you feel protected from chaos. Improvement promises safety, but safety built on constant effort is fragile. It collapses the moment effort fails. The Dharma offers a different kind of safety, one that comes from understanding impermanence rather than fighting it. When you see that all states change, you no longer need to perfect yourself to survive them. You ride the movement instead of trying to control it. There is also grief hidden inside self-optimization, a quiet mourning for the self you think you should have been by now. This grief fuels urgency. I'm behind. I should be further along. Buddhism invites you to see that these timelines are mental constructs, not truths. Time softens when striving softens. You stop racing toward a version of yourself that exists only as an idea. You return to the reality of this moment, where life is already happening without needing improvement. This does not mean you abandon skillful action. It means action is no longer fueled by self-rejection. You still learn, you still adjust, but you do so from care, not contempt, from curiosity, not condemnation. One of the most radical aspects of the Dharma is its refusal to make peace conditional on progress. Peace is not a reward for improvement. It is the ground from which wise action arises. When peace is treated as a prize, it remains distant. When the drive to improve relaxes, something surprising happens. Energy returns, not frantic energy, but steady presence. The body feels less threatened. The mind becomes less defensive. Learning happens naturally because it is no longer forced. This shift also affects rest. Rest is no longer something you earn after being productive. It becomes a valid state in itself. Sleep comes easier when the mind is not trying to become someone else before allowing rest. There is a quiet dignity in allowing yourself to be unfinished, not as an excuse, but as a recognition of reality. Life is a process, not a product. Treating yourself like a project denies this truth and creates suffering. Buddhism does not ask you to lower standards or abandon care. It asks you to stop turning care into cruelty, to stop confusing discipline with punishment, to stop using improvement as a way to escape the present. When improvement loses its violent edge, growth becomes gentler and more sustainable. You move not because you hate where you are, but because movement is natural. You rest not because you failed, but because rest is part of life. This is where effort and ease finally stop being enemies. Effort arises when needed. Ease returns when effort is done. Neither defines your worth. Neither needs to be defended. As the need to be better fades, a deeper trust takes its place. Trust that life can unfold without constant correction. Trust that understanding is more powerful than force. Trust that you are allowed to be here now without improvement as an entry requirement. And in that trust, something deeply healing happens. The inner violence quiets. The endless project pauses. And what remains is not stagnation, but a calm readiness to meet life as it is, without turning yourself into something that must be fixed first. As the inner pressure to improve begins to dissolve, something else becomes visible in the space it leaves behind. When you are no longer trying to fix yourself, a new question quietly surfaces about how you relate to others. The same energy once turned inward often turns outward. The urge to help, the need to guide, the instinct to step in. And hidden beneath good intentions, there can be another form of tension. The belief that love means correction and care means control. There is a deep emotional pull behind the desire to intervene. It often comes from empathy mixed with discomfort. Seeing someone struggle can stir anxiety. Their confusion can awaken your own. Their pain can trigger a need to resolve something quickly, not only for them, but for yourself. Action feels relieving. Advice feels useful. Doing something feels kind. But Buddhism asks a question that unsettles this reflex. What if stepping back is sometimes the most compassionate act? Non-interference does not mean indifference. It does not mean turning away from suffering. It means recognizing the difference between presence and intrusion. True compassion does not always rush toward action. Sometimes it stays still long enough to understand what is actually needed. Much harm is done in the name of help. Advice is given before understanding is complete. Solutions are offered to emotions that have not been felt. Guidance is imposed where space is needed. This happens not because people lack kindness, but because they lack patience with discomfort. When you try to fix another person, there is often an unspoken message beneath the words. It says, "You should not be this way." Even when spoken gently, the body feels it. The nervous system tightens, trust weakens. The person may comply outwardly but feel unseen inwardly. Buddhist compassion begins with respect for another person's process. It acknowledges that each individual lives within their own web of conditions. Their timing is not yours. Their lessons are not yours. Their growth cannot be rushed without cost. There is also humility in non-interference. It recognizes that you do not fully know what another person needs, even if you care deeply. The desire to guide often carries a subtle assumption of superiority, the belief that you see more clearly. This assumption may not be conscious, but it shapes how help is offered. True compassion does not require you to be right. It requires you to be present. Presence listens without rushing to conclusion. It allows silence. It lets emotions unfold without immediately trying to change them. Many people confuse compassion with problem solving, but emotional pain is not always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it is a passage to be walked through. Intervening too quickly can interrupt a process that needs time to complete. This is especially difficult when watching loved ones struggle. The instinct to protect can override wisdom, but protection that removes struggle too quickly can weaken resilience. Buddhism does not glorify suffering, but it recognizes that certain insights only arise through direct experience. Non-interference is not abandonment. It is a form of trust. Trust that another person has their own intelligence, their own capacity to learn, their own inner resources. When you interfere unnecessarily, you silently communicate doubt in that capacity. This doubt is often learned early. Many people grew up in environments where emotions were managed, corrected, or dismissed. They were taught that discomfort should be fixed quickly. As adults, they repeat this pattern with others, believing it is care. Breaking this pattern requires tolerating discomfort. It means staying present with someone's pain without rushing to remove it. This can feel helpless at first. The mind asks, "What am I supposed to do?" Buddhism answers softly, be here. Being here does not mean doing nothing. It means listening deeply. It means asking before advising. It means offering support without taking over. It means allowing the other person to lead their own process. Non-interference also protects dignity. When you constantly guide or correct someone, you reduce their sense of agency. Even well-meaning help can make a person feel small. Compassion honors autonomy. There is a subtle violence in unsolicited advice. It assumes access to a truth the other person lacks. It bypasses curiosity. It often serves the helper's need to feel useful more than the other's need to be understood. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from causes and conditions. This applies to others as much as to yourself. When you understand this, judgment softens. You stop seeing people as broken or misguided. You see them as responding to what they have been given. This perspective changes how boundaries work. Non-interference does not mean allowing harm. When action is needed to prevent clear damage, compassion acts. But it acts without ego, without the need to control outcomes, without attachment to being seen as good. There is wisdom in knowing when to step in and when to step back. This wisdom does not come from rules, it comes from awareness, from sensing whether intervention will support growth or replace it. Many conflicts escalate because both sides are trying to help each other in ways that are not wanted. Advice becomes pressure. Concern becomes control. Non-interference can de-escalate tension by removing the need to defend. This teaching also applies inwardly. Just as you learn to stop violently improving yourself, you learn to stop micromanaging others. The same kindness you extend to yourself becomes the kindness you extend outward. Non-interference creates space for authenticity. When people are not being guided, corrected, or fixed, they are more likely to reveal what is truly happening for them. Trust deepens. Communication becomes more honest. There is also patience here, a long view of life. Not everything needs to be resolved now. Not every struggle needs immediate clarity. Some understanding ripens slowly, in ways no external guidance could replicate. Buddhism recognizes that suffering, when not interfered with prematurely, often carries its own wisdom. This does not mean suffering is good. It means it is informative. It teaches through experience rather than instruction. Non-interference also reduces burnout. When you stop taking responsibility for others' inner worlds, your energy returns. You care without depletion. You support without exhaustion. Compassion becomes sustainable. There is a quiet courage required to practice this. It takes courage to resist the urge to rescue, courage to trust silence, courage to allow outcomes you cannot control. This courage grows from understanding impermanence. You know that states change, that confusion passes, that growth unfolds in time. You no longer panic at temporary discomfort. Non-interference does not make relationships cold, it makes them spacious. It allows each person to breathe. It removes the pressure to perform or improve for the sake of being accepted. When you stop interfering, you also stop needing others to change to feel okay. This is a profound freedom. You can love without conditions. You can be present without agenda. This teaching is especially important in a world obsessed with fixing productivity, fixing emotions, fixing people. Buddhism offers a counterbalance. It reminds you that not everything broken needs repair. Some things need witnessing. In deep presence, something shifts. The other person often finds their own words, their own clarity, their own next step. Not because you guided them there, but because you did not block the process with interference. This is compassion that trusts life, compassion that does not rush, compassion that does not dominate, compassion that allows. As this understanding settles, relationships become less tense and more real. You stop managing people and start meeting them. You stop correcting and start connecting. And in that connection, something profound happens. Healing becomes possible not because you made it happen, but because you did not stand in the way. When the urge to interfere begins to soften, another habit of the mind comes into clearer view. It is not loud or aggressive. It often sounds reasonable, even wise. It speaks in firm statements, strong opinions, solid plans. It promises safety. It promises clarity. And yet beneath this certainty, there is often a quiet fear that has never been fully acknowledged. Certainty feels comforting because it reduces the unknown. The mind relaxes when it believes it knows what is right, what will happen next, who is correct, and who is mistaken. Plans create the feeling of ground beneath your feet. Opinions create a sense of identity. Beliefs offer structure in a world that constantly shifts. But Buddhism gently asks what is being protected by this constant need to be sure. At its core, certainty is often a response to discomfort with not knowing. The mind prefers a flawed answer to open uncertainty. Even a painful belief can feel safer than ambiguity. This is because uncertainty exposes vulnerability. It reminds you that life cannot be fully predicted, managed, or secured. And for a nervous system shaped by fear, this feels threatening. The mind clings to certainty the way a hand clings to a railing in the dark. It tightens when it cannot see what lies ahead. Opinions become anchors. Beliefs become shields. Plans become promises against chaos. But these tools come at a cost. They narrow perception. They harden flexibility. They turn curiosity into defense. When you strongly identify with an opinion, any challenge to it feels personal. A disagreement becomes a threat. A new perspective feels like an attack. The body reacts before the mind has time to reflect. This reaction reveals something important. Certainty is not neutral, it is emotionally charged. Buddhism does not tell you to abandon discernment or wisdom. It does not suggest that all views are equal or that clarity is dangerous. What it questions is attachment to views, the need for them to remain fixed, the fear that arises when they are questioned. This attachment often begins early. Many people learned that being right meant being safe, that having answers meant being valued, that uncertainty meant weakness or failure. Over time, the mind learns to hide behind confidence. It builds an identity around knowing. But life continually undermines this identity. Plans fall apart. Beliefs are challenged by experience. Certainty cracks under pressure. Each crack reveals anxiety that was always there, quietly held in place by conviction. The fear hidden inside certainty is the fear of groundlessness. The fear that without solid answers, you will fall apart. Buddhism does not try to eliminate this fear by offering new beliefs. It invites you to feel it directly, without immediately covering it up. Uncertainty is not an enemy in Buddhist understanding. It is a doorway. When the mind stops demanding closure, it becomes more open, more responsive, more alive. Uncertainty allows learning. It allows humility. It allows peace to arise without needing guarantees. Peace built on certainty is fragile. It depends on the world behaving as expected. When reality deviates, peace collapses. Peace that comes from openness is more stable. It does not rely on outcomes. It rests in the ability to meet whatever arises. Plans are not wrong. They are practical tools. But when they become emotional crutches, they create tension. The mind becomes invested in their success. Any deviation feels like failure. The body stays on alert, monitoring reality for compliance. Buddhism invites a different relationship with planning. You plan lightly. You hold intentions without gripping them. You act where action is appropriate and remain flexible when conditions change. This flexibility reduces stress more effectively than perfect planning ever could. Beliefs operate in a similar way. They provide orientation, but when clung to, they become prisons. The mind stops listening. It stops questioning. It stops adapting. Over time, beliefs meant to provide clarity create rigidity. Uncertainty reopens the field. It allows you to say, "I don't know," without collapse. This phrase, when truly felt, is not empty. It is spacious. It removes the pressure to defend a position. It allows genuine inquiry. Many people fear that without certainty, they will lose direction. But direction does not come from rigid answers. It comes from values, awareness, and responsiveness. You can care deeply without knowing everything. You can act wisely without guarantees. The mind often confuses uncertainty with danger. This confusion is learned. It comes from past experiences where unpredictability was associated with harm. Buddhism does not dismiss this history. It acknowledges it and gently retrains the system to see uncertainty differently. When uncertainty is allowed, the nervous system begins to relax, not immediately but gradually. It learns that not knowing does not equal threat. That openness does not mean collapse. This learning happens through experience, not logic. One of the most profound shifts occurs when you stop needing to be right. Not because you don't care about truth, but because you care more about freedom. Rightness becomes less important than understanding. Winning becomes less important than listening. This shift changes conversations. You listen without preparing rebuttals. You speak without needing to dominate. Disagreements become explorations rather than battles. Relationships soften. The mind's attachment to certainty also shapes how it relates to itself. Many people cling to stories about who they are. I am this kind of person. I am not that kind of person. These identities provide stability, but they also limit growth. Uncertainty allows identity to loosen. You stop needing to define yourself so tightly. You allow contradiction. You allow change. You allow complexity. This creates psychological flexibility, which is closely linked to well-being. Buddhism points out that reality itself is uncertain. Everything changes. Trying to secure certainty in an impermanent world is exhausting. Accepting uncertainty aligns you with how things actually are. This acceptance is not resignation, it is realism. It allows you to respond appropriately instead of reacting defensively. When you are not busy protecting a belief, you can see what is actually happening. There is also a quiet relief in not having to know. The burden of having answers lifts. You stop performing confidence, you stop pretending. Authenticity becomes easier. Uncertainty also deepens compassion. When you realize how much you do not know, judgment softens. You become less quick to label others. You see how complex each life is. This understanding fosters kindness. The fear hidden inside certainty often shows itself as impatience, a need for quick conclusions, a discomfort with silence. Buddhism encourages slowing down, letting questions remain open, allowing understanding to unfold over time. This patience creates space for insight. Insight rarely arrives under pressure. It arises when the mind is relaxed and receptive. Certainty blocks this receptivity. Uncertainty invites it. There is a paradox here. The more comfortable you become with not knowing, the clearer life feels. Not because answers suddenly appear, but because you are no longer fighting the absence of them. Peace does not require certainty, it requires trust. Trust not in outcomes, but in your capacity to meet experience. This trust grows as you repeatedly face uncertainty and discover you are still okay. The mind learns that it does not need to lock reality into fixed meanings to survive. It can flow, it can adapt, it can rest. This rest is especially important at night. Many sleepless hours are spent rehearsing plans, defending beliefs, seeking closure. When the need for certainty softens, the mind can finally pause. It does not need to solve life before sleeping. Uncertainty becomes a doorway because it returns you to the present. The present does not require answers. It only asks for attention. When attention is here, peace is already possible. This does not mean you stop thinking. It means thinking loses its grip. Thoughts are seen as tools, not truths that must be defended. They come and go without controlling the whole system. As certainty loosens, humility grows. Not humiliation, but an honest recognition of limits. This humility is freeing. It removes the pressure to be more than human. And in that freedom, something settles. The mind stops bracing, the body softens, the need to know relaxes. What remains is a quiet openness, where peace does not depend on answers, and life is allowed to unfold without being constantly pinned down. Uncertainty, once feared, becomes a companion, not because it feels good all the time, but because it no longer feels dangerous. And through this companionship, the heart finds a peace that certainty could never provide. As the grip of certainty loosens and the mind learns to rest without answers, another pattern quietly reveals itself underneath. Even without fixed beliefs or rigid opinions, there can still be a deep hunger for knowing what comes next. A subtle leaning toward the familiar, a preference for routines that don't surprise, a need for life to follow a script. This is where control hides most comfortably, not in loud domination, but in the craving for predictability. There is a calm that comes from knowing what tomorrow looks like. The body relaxes when patterns repeat. The mind feels safer when outcomes seem familiar. This is not a flaw, it is a learned response. Predictability once protected you. It reduced shock. It allowed preparation. Over time, however, this preference hardens into dependence. The ego begins to rely on predictability not just for comfort, but for identity. The ego is not a thing you possess. It is a pattern of contraction around continuity. It wants life to stay recognizable so it can stay intact. It feeds on repetition. It stabilizes itself by saying, "This is how things are." And when life refuses to cooperate, anxiety appears. Impermanence is not threatening in theory. Most people accept change intellectually, but emotionally, impermanence challenges the ego's sense of survival. If everything changes, what remains of me? Predictability offers a temporary answer. It says, as long as things repeat, I remain. Control grows from this fear. Not always as domination, but as planning, forecasting, managing, rehearsing. The mind runs scenarios not because it loves effort, but because it fears being caught off guard. Uncertainty feels like exposure, predictability feels like armor. Buddhism does not criticize this impulse. It understands its roots. The teaching simply points out its cost. Predictability creates stability only on the surface. Underneath, it increases fragility. The more you rely on things staying the same, the more shaken you become when they don't. This is why people who crave control often feel anxious even when life is calm. Calm feels temporary. The mind waits for disruption. It scans for threats. Predictability becomes something to protect, and protection requires vigilance. The ego's addiction to predictability also shapes how people relate to emotions. Familiar emotional states, even painful ones, can feel safer than unfamiliar peace. Anxiety can become a known environment. Letting go of it feels risky because it changes the inner landscape. This explains why people sometimes sabotage calm moments. When the nervous system is used to tension, relaxation feels unfamiliar. Predictability matters more than comfort. The ego would rather suffer in known ways than rest in unknown ones. Embracing unpredictability does not mean inviting chaos. It means loosening resistance to change. It means recognizing that stability does not come from freezing life, but from learning to move with it. Buddhism teaches impermanence not to unsettle you, but to free you. When you stop expecting things to last, you stop clinging. When you stop clinging, the mind relaxes. This relaxation is deeper than the comfort predictability provides. The irony is subtle. Trying to make life predictable increases fear because it puts you in constant opposition to reality. Reality changes, always. Fighting this truth keeps the nervous system in a state of low-level alarm. When unpredictability is allowed, the system gradually learns that change is survivable. That surprise does not equal collapse. That you can meet new conditions without losing yourself. This learning does not happen through force. It happens through experience. Each time something unexpected occurs and you respond without panic, trust grows. The mind begins to stabilize, not around sameness, but around adaptability. Adaptability is a more reliable form of stability. It does not depend on outcomes. It depends on presence. When you are present, you can respond to what is actually happening rather than what you hoped would happen. Predictability narrows attention. It focuses on maintaining patterns. Unpredictability widens attention. It invites curiosity. Curiosity softens fear. When you are curious, you are less defensive. The ego resists unpredictability because it threatens control. Control promises safety, but safety built on control is brittle. Safety built on trust in awareness is resilient. This shift changes how the body feels. When you stop bracing against change, muscles soften, breath deepens. The nervous system spends less energy preparing for imagined futures. Embracing unpredictability also alters how you relate to success and failure. Predictability ties worth to outcomes. If things go as planned, you are okay. If they don't, something feels wrong with you. Unpredictability breaks this link. You learn that outcomes fluctuate independently of worth. This is deeply stabilizing. You stop riding emotional highs and lows so intensely. You stop equating control with security. You stop needing constant confirmation that life is on track. The ego's addiction to predictability also shows up in relationships. People want others to behave consistently. When someone changes, discomfort arises. Expectations are challenged. Control attempts follow. Allowing unpredictability in relationships means allowing people to grow, change, and surprise you. This can feel threatening at first, but it also deepens intimacy. You meet the person as they are now, not as they were. Buddhism recognizes that attachment to predictability creates suffering because it resists impermanence. Impermanence is not an error in the system. It is the system. When this is understood, control loosens naturally. Not because you force yourself to stop controlling, but because controlling feels unnecessary. You trust that you can respond. This trust stabilizes the mind in a way routines never could. Routines depend on external consistency. Trust depends on internal capacity. This capacity grows as you face unpredictability and survive it. Each unexpected change becomes evidence, not of danger, but of resilience. Even fear itself becomes less threatening. Fear is unpredictable in nature. When you stop demanding predictability, fear can rise and fall without dominating the system. This also changes how you relate to time. Predictability pulls attention into the future. Unpredictability brings attention back to now. The present moment is the only place where response is possible. When attention returns to the present, anxiety loses fuel. Anxiety feeds on anticipation. Presence dissolves anticipation. The mind begins to rest, not because it knows what will happen, but because it no longer needs to know. This is a profound rest. Sleep becomes easier in this state. The mind no longer rehearses futures. It no longer tries to lock tomorrow into place. It allows the unknown to remain unknown. There is courage here, but not the dramatic kind. A quiet courage, the courage to not know, the courage to not plan every outcome, the courage to let life surprise you. This courage does not make life reckless. It makes it responsive. You still plan where appropriate. You still prepare where useful, but you no longer confuse preparation with control. Control tightens, responsiveness flows. The ego's addiction to predictability weakens as you experience this difference. You begin to feel that unpredictability does not destabilize you, it steadies you, because steadiness no longer depends on life behaving. It depends on your relationship to change. And in that relationship, something unexpected happens. The mind becomes calmer. Not because the world is predictable, but because unpredictability no longer feels like a threat. This calm is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not require explanation. It simply remains, even as life moves. Impermanence, once feared, becomes a teacher. It shows you that nothing needs to be held too tightly, that nothing defines you permanently, that you can move, adjust, and rest within change itself. And in this movement, the ego loosens its grip. Control fades. Predictability loses its power. What remains is a grounded presence that does not depend on sameness, but on the simple fact of being here, ready for whatever arrives next. As the mind learns to rest without needing predictability, another habit quietly comes into focus. It doesn't shout. It doesn't plan. It speaks instead through explanation, clarification, defense. A reflex to fill space, a need to be seen correctly, a subtle tension that says, "Let me tell you who I am so nothing is misunderstood." When this habit softens, a different kind of freedom becomes possible. There is a deep emotional vulnerability tied to speech. Words are not just sounds. They carry identity. They protect image. They attempt to secure belonging. Much of what people say is not meant to communicate truth, but to manage how they are perceived. Silence, in this sense, feels risky. It removes the armor of explanation. Buddhist renunciation is often misunderstood as withdrawal from life, but the renunciation spoken of here is far more intimate. It is the letting go of the need to narrate yourself, the release of the urge to correct how others see you, the quiet decision to stop proving. This form of silence is not moral. It is not about being virtuous or restrained. It is about noticing how much energy is spent trying to control interpretation. Every explanation carries a hope. If they understand me, I will be safe. But safety built on being understood is unstable. Understanding changes. People misread. Silence asks a harder question. What if you no longer needed that safety? The compulsion to explain often arises from fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of being blamed. Fear of being unseen. The mind rushes to fill gaps with context, justification, clarification. But each word reinforces the belief that your inner state depends on external agreement. Silence interrupts this pattern, not abruptly, gently. It reveals how often speech is used to stabilize identity. When you stop explaining, you may feel exposed at first. The ego searches for footing. It asks, "Who am I if I don't define myself?" This discomfort is not a problem. It is the doorway. Silence allows experience to be what it is without commentary. It creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, reactivity softens. You no longer feel compelled to defend every misunderstanding or correct every assumption. This does not mean you never speak. It means speech becomes intentional rather than reflexive. Words arise from clarity instead of anxiety. When something truly needs to be said, it will still be said. Silence does not suppress truth. It protects it from being diluted by fear. Much suffering comes from the endless attempt to be known, to be seen accurately, to have your inner world reflected correctly by others. Buddhism gently points out the futility of this project. No one can fully know you, not because they don't care, but because experience is fluid. When you stop demanding to be understood, relationships change. They become lighter, less performative. You listen more deeply because you are no longer rehearsing your explanation. You speak less because you no longer need constant validation. There is also humility here. Silence admits, "I don't need to be right about myself." It allows identity to loosen. You stop holding a fixed image of who you are. You let life express itself without narration. This is especially powerful in moments of conflict. The urge to explain often escalates tension. Each side adds more words, hoping clarity will arrive through volume. Silence can interrupt this escalation. It gives space for emotions to settle. It removes fuel from argument. Silence also reveals how often words are used to escape discomfort. When something feels awkward, speech rushes in to smooth it over. When sadness appears, explanation tries to contain it. When uncertainty arises, language rushes to close it. Allowing silence means allowing discomfort to exist without immediate resolution. This builds emotional resilience. You learn that not everything needs to be explained to be survivable. There is also a deep connection between silence and rest. The mind that constantly narrates cannot fully relax. Even alone, it speaks, it replays, it justifies. Silence turns the volume down. This quiet is not emptiness, it is spaciousness. Thoughts may still arise, but they are not constantly verbalized internally. This reduces mental fatigue in a profound way. Silence as renunciation also means releasing the need to correct the past. Many explanations are aimed backward. What I meant was, what really happened was. Letting these go frees you from living in replay mode. It also releases the future. Many explanations are anticipatory. Just in case they think, silence refuses to live ahead of time. It stays here. This presence stabilizes the nervous system. Without constant self-explanation, the body feels less evaluated. Breath deepens, muscles soften. There is less internal pressure. Silence also sharpens awareness. When you are not preparing to speak, you notice more. Tone, body language, subtle shifts in energy. This awareness deepens understanding far more than explanation ever could. In Buddhist practice, silence is often used not as avoidance, but as insight. It reveals how much of identity is constructed through speech. When speech quiets, identity becomes less rigid. This can feel unsettling. The ego asks for landmarks, silence provides none, and yet something stable emerges underneath, a sense of being that does not depend on articulation. This stability does not require others to agree with you. It does not require recognition. It exists quietly, without announcement. There is also compassion in silence, not the dramatic kind, but the gentle kind that does not impose interpretation. You allow others to have their experience without correcting it. You allow yourself to be misunderstood without collapsing. This does not mean accepting harm. Boundaries can still be expressed, but they are expressed cleanly, without excess explanation. A simple no becomes enough. Excess explanation often weakens boundaries. It invites debate. Silence strengthens them by removing negotiation. Silence as renunciation is also freedom from storytelling. You stop turning every experience into a narrative. You let moments pass without meaning-making. This lightens the mind. Meaning will still arise when needed, but it will not be forced. It will come from clarity rather than compulsion. This practice changes how you relate to solitude. Silence becomes less threatening. Being alone with yourself no longer requires constant mental conversation. You begin to rest in simple awareness. Sleep deepens here. The mind no longer needs to rehearse explanations for tomorrow. It no longer needs to resolve misunderstandings before rest. It allows the day to end unfinished. There is a quiet confidence in silence, not arrogance, not withdrawal. Confidence that you do not need to manage perception to exist safely. This confidence grows slowly. Each time you choose not to explain, not to justify, not to clarify unnecessarily, you discover that nothing collapses. The world continues. You continue. This discovery is liberating. It shows you how much effort was being spent unnecessarily. Energy returns, presence sharpens. Silence also protects intimacy. When everything is explained, mystery dies. Allowing mystery keeps relationships alive. It allows discovery rather than definition. In a world that demands constant expression, choosing silence is radical. Not as rebellion, but as rest. It is a refusal to turn life into a performance. This silence does not isolate you. It connects you more deeply. Because you are no longer speaking from fear, when you do speak, it matters. As this renunciation settles, something unexpected happens. The need to control through words fades. The need to be seen relaxes. The heart feels less exposed and more grounded at the same time. And in this quiet, a deeper listening begins, not just to others, but to life itself. Without narration, without defense, without explanation, silence becomes not an absence, but a home, a place where nothing needs to be added for you to be whole. As silence becomes less threatening and the need to explain begins to fade, another layer of experience quietly comes into view. Without constant narration, without defending or correcting reality, something uncomfortable but honest reveals itself. What remains is not always pleasant. Sensations arise, emotions move, circumstances unfold in ways you did not choose. And it is here that suffering is often misunderstood. There is a common belief that suffering comes from pain, from loss, from discomfort, from events going wrong. But Buddhism points to something more precise and more unsettling. Pain may arise, but suffering is born in the moment the mind says, "This should not be happening." It is not the sensation itself that creates the deepest distress. It is the refusal to allow the sensation to exist. This refusal is subtle. It often sounds reasonable. I don't want this. This isn't fair. This shouldn't be like this. These thoughts feel natural, even justified, but they create friction between experience and expectation, and it is this friction that burns. Pain moves through the body. It has texture, it has intensity, it changes. Suffering, on the other hand, stays stuck. It loops, it tightens. It adds layers of mental resistance on top of raw experience. The body feels pain. The mind demands a different reality. This demand is rarely conscious. Most people don't wake up deciding to reject reality. It happens automatically. Preference arises. The mind compares what is happening to what it wants to be happening. When they don't match, tension forms. This tension is exhausting. It keeps the nervous system in a state of protest. The body braces. The mind argues. Energy is spent fighting what is already here. Buddhism does not ask you to like pain. It does not glorify hardship. It simply distinguishes between what is unavoidable and what is optional. Pain is often unavoidable. Resistance is optional, and resistance is what turns pain into suffering. This is not a moral statement. It is an observation. When experience is allowed, it moves. When it is resisted, it hardens. Many people fear that allowing reality means giving up or approving of harm. But allowance is not agreement. It is not endorsement. It is acknowledgement. You can see clearly without liking what you see. Refusal often comes from fear. Fear that if you allow something, it will never change. Fear that acceptance means permanence. But Buddhism teaches impermanence precisely to address this fear. Everything changes, whether you resist it or not. Resistance does not stop change. It only adds strain. When you allow what is present, you are not locking it in place. You are removing the struggle around it. This often allows change to happen more naturally. Suffering thrives on comparison. This moment compared to how it should be. This life compared to another. This body compared to an imagined ideal. Comparison fuels dissatisfaction. It keeps attention focused on absence rather than presence. When comparison softens, experience becomes simpler, not easier, but cleaner. There is less commentary, less judgment, less internal debate. The demand that reality conform to preference often shows up as impatience. This should be over by now. I should feel better already. Time becomes an enemy. The present becomes a problem. This impatience adds urgency to suffering. It accelerates it. It convinces the mind that something has gone wrong because discomfort remains. Buddhism invites patience not as endurance but as openness. Patience means allowing experience to unfold at its own pace. It means releasing the demand for immediate resolution. This is deeply counter to modern conditioning. The world teaches speed, efficiency, solutions. Buddhism teaches presence, understanding, allowance. Allowance does not mean passivity. You can take action when action is appropriate, but action rooted in refusal is tense. Action rooted in clarity is calm. When you act from refusal, the body feels pressured. When you act from allowance, the body feels grounded. There is a quiet relief in stopping the argument with reality. Even when circumstances remain difficult, the extra layer of suffering dissolves. The mind no longer fights the moment. This does not mean emotions disappear. Sadness still arises, fear still arises, anger still arises, but they are experienced directly, without being wrapped in stories of injustice or personal failure. Suffering intensifies when experience is personalized. Why is this happening to me? This question assumes that life should treat you differently. It implies entitlement to a certain outcome. When reality fails to comply, resentment grows. Buddhism gently removes this personalization, not by denying individuality, but by showing that events arise from conditions, not personal targeting. This perspective reduces bitterness. Allowing what is does not make you weak, it makes you resilient. You stop wasting energy on denial. You meet life as it arrives. This meeting is not dramatic, it is quiet. It happens moment by moment. Each time you notice resistance and soften it slightly, suffering loosens. The body often responds before the mind understands. When resistance drops, breath deepens. Muscles relax. There is a subtle sense of space. This space allows wisdom to function. When the mind is not busy rejecting reality, it can see options clearly. It can respond skillfully. Suffering also arises from clinging to pleasure, wanting good experiences to last, demanding comfort. When pleasure inevitably changes, disappointment follows. Allowing impermanence applies to pleasant experiences as well. You enjoy them fully without needing to freeze them. This prevents the suffering that comes from loss. There is freedom in letting experience be transient. You stop building your happiness on conditions that cannot be held. The refusal to allow what is often comes from the belief that happiness is elsewhere, in a different moment, in a different version of life. This belief keeps the present devalued. Buddhism points back to this moment, not because it is perfect, but because it is the only place where life is happening. Rejecting it means rejecting life itself. Allowance reconnects you to aliveness. Even discomfort becomes part of being here. This does not romanticize pain, it contextualizes it. There is also humility in allowance. You stop demanding that life serve your preferences. You recognize that preferences are just preferences, not laws. This humility softens anger, it softens entitlement, it softens the constant inner complaint. Suffering often feels personal because preference feels personal. But preferences are conditioned. They arise from culture, memory, habit. Seeing this reduces their authority. When preference loosens its grip, reality feels less adversarial. You stop seeing life as something that needs to comply. Allowance also deepens compassion. When you see how suffering arises from resistance, you understand others more deeply. You stop judging their pain. You see the struggle underneath. This understanding does not make you passive, it makes you kind. Allowing what is also affects rest. Much insomnia comes from resisting the present state. I should be asleep. This thought alone creates tension. When you allow wakefulness, sleep often follows. Not because you forced it, but because resistance stopped. This principle applies broadly. What you allow tends to move. What you resist tends to stay. There is a quiet intelligence in experience itself. When not interfered with, it unfolds naturally. This includes pain. Allowing does not mean drowning in experience. It means staying with it without adding unnecessary struggle. Over time, this practice reshapes the nervous system. It learns that discomfort is survivable, that resistance is optional, that peace does not require perfect conditions. This learning is gradual. It happens through repeated moments of allowance. Each moment reduces suffering slightly. Eventually, something shifts. Reality no longer feels like an enemy. Life feels less personal and more intimate at the same time. You stop demanding that the world conform to your preferences, and in that stopping, a surprising peace appears. Not because pain vanished, but because the fight against it ended. This peace is quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply remains steady, even as life continues to change. And in that steadiness, suffering loses its grip, not through force, but through permission. As the struggle with reality softens and experience is allowed to be as it is, another deeply rooted belief begins to surface. It often sounds noble. It is praised by society. It feels mature and ethical. It says, "This is my responsibility." At first glance, it looks like strength. But when looked at closely, it can quietly turn into another way the ego tightens its grip. There is an emotional weight carried by the idea of personal responsibility that few people question. From an early age, many are taught that being a good person means taking ownership of everything they do, everything they feel, and often everything that happens around them. This teaching is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete, and when it is taken too far, it becomes a trap. The trap forms when responsibility turns into identity, when "I am responsible" becomes "I am the owner of outcomes, the owner of mistakes, the owner of emotions, the owner of success." This ownership quietly reinforces the sense of a solid self at the center of experience. And with that reinforcement comes pressure, fear, and self-judgment. Buddhism does not reject responsibility, it reframes it. It separates accountability from ownership. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Accountability means responding to what arises. Ownership means believing that there is a permanent self who caused it all and must carry it forever. Accountability is fluid. Ownership is heavy. When responsibility becomes ego reinforcement, it often shows up as over-identification. "This happened because of me. I should have known better. I must fix this." These thoughts create a tight loop of self-focus. Even when intentions are good, the mind turns inward in a way that increases suffering. This kind of responsibility does not feel empowering. It feels burdensome. The body tightens. The mind replays the past. The future becomes a constant worry. Responsibility becomes something to endure rather than something to live. Buddhism invites a different view. Actions have consequences. Choices matter. But actions arise from conditions, and consequences unfold through conditions. You participate in this process, but you do not own it in the way the ego assumes. When you understand this, responsibility becomes lighter. You still respond when harm occurs. You still make amends. You still learn. But you do not turn every mistake into a verdict about who you are. Many people confuse self-blame with responsibility. They believe that if they stop blaming themselves, they will become careless. Buddhism shows the opposite. Self-blame clouds perception. It narrows attention. It keeps the mind stuck in the past. Clear accountability looks forward. It asks, what is needed now? It does not ask, how bad am I? This forward-facing orientation is far more effective and far less painful. Responsibility becomes a trap when it feeds pride as well. Success can inflate the ego just as much as failure can crush it. I did this. This proves something about me. Pride and guilt are two sides of the same ownership coin. Buddhism loosens both by pointing out that no outcome arises from a single cause. Effort plays a role. So do timing, support, chance, and countless unseen factors. Recognizing this does not diminish effort. It contextualizes it. This context brings humility without humiliation. You can appreciate success without clinging to it. You can acknowledge failure without collapsing under it. The ego loves ownership because it gives a sense of solidity. This is mine. But solidity comes at a cost. It resists change. It resists forgiveness. It resists growth. When responsibility is held without ownership, change becomes easier. You can say, "This action caused harm," without saying, "I am harm." This distinction protects dignity while still allowing learning. This reframing also changes how you relate to control. Ownership implies control. Accountability does not. Accountability responds to what is present. Control tries to dictate what should be. Many people feel responsible not only for their actions but for how others feel. This is where responsibility becomes especially heavy. You try to manage reactions, emotions, outcomes that are not fully yours to manage. Buddhism clarifies this boundary. You are responsible for your intentions and actions. You are not responsible for controlling how they land in every context. Others bring their own conditions. When this is seen clearly, guilt softens. You still care. You still apologize when appropriate. But you stop carrying emotional debt for things beyond your influence. Responsibility without ownership also changes how you relate to mistakes. Mistakes become information rather than condemnation. They show you what did not work, not who you are. This perspective encourages curiosity instead of punishment. What led to this? What can be adjusted? These questions lead to growth. Self-attack does not. Buddhism emphasizes intention because intention is where accountability lives. You are accountable for the quality of your intention, not for guaranteeing outcomes. This removes an impossible burden. Outcomes are shaped by countless variables. Demanding ownership over them creates anxiety. Releasing ownership allows you to act sincerely and then let go. This is deeply freeing. You stop trying to be perfect. You focus on being present and responsive. Responsibility as ego reinforcement also shows up in moral rigidity. People cling to identities like good person or bad person. These labels simplify reality but distort it. Buddhism avoids fixed moral identities. It looks at actions and their effects, not at permanent character traits. This allows accountability without shame. Shame paralyzes. Accountability mobilizes. Shame says, "I am wrong." Accountability says, "Something went wrong." The difference is everything. When responsibility is reframed this way, relationships change. Conflicts become less defensive. You can acknowledge impact without arguing about intent endlessly. You can listen without needing to protect your image. This listening deepens connection. It builds trust. It allows repair. Responsibility without ownership also affects how you treat yourself internally. You stop policing every thought and feeling. You recognize that thoughts arise from conditions, just like actions. You become accountable for how you relate to thoughts, not for their existence. This reduces inner conflict dramatically. There is also a deep relief in letting go of the fantasy of total responsibility. The fantasy that if you try hard enough, nothing will go wrong. This fantasy is exhausting. When you release it, you accept that life includes unpredictability, that mistakes will happen, that learning is ongoing. This acceptance does not make you careless. It makes you resilient. You recover faster. You adapt more easily. You forgive more readily. Responsibility becomes something you practice moment by moment, not something you carry as a fixed weight. It becomes an action, not an identity. This is especially important for rest. Many people cannot rest because they feel responsible for everything all the time. The mind keeps working, fixing, reviewing. When ownership loosens, rest becomes possible. You recognize that the world does not collapse when you stop managing it. Sleep deepens when responsibility is held lightly. The mind no longer rehearses every error or prepares for every contingency. It allows the day to end incomplete. There is also compassion here. When you see how responsibility can trap you, you see how it traps others. Judgment softens. You stop demanding perfection. Buddhism does not ask you to abandon ethics. It asks you to ground ethics in awareness rather than ego. Ethics arise naturally when you are present and connected, not when you are self-policing. This natural ethics is flexible and responsive. It adjusts to context. It does not rely on rigid rules or self-concepts. Responsibility without ownership also means letting go of martyrdom. You stop carrying burdens to prove worth. You stop sacrificing yourself to maintain an image of goodness. This frees energy. You give because you care, not because you feel obligated. You help without resentment. As this understanding settles, the self feels less heavy. The constant monitoring eases. Life feels less like a test and more like a conversation. You still respond, you still care, you still act, but you no longer turn responsibility into a story about who you are. And in that release, something quiet but powerful happens. The ego loosens its grip. Accountability remains, clean and simple. Ownership falls away. What remains is a steady presence that responds to life honestly, learns without cruelty, and rests without guilt. A responsibility that no longer traps, but frees. As responsibility loosens its grip and the need to own every outcome begins to fade, the sense of self often looks for a quieter place to settle. When the old identities lose their power, a new one can form, softer, more refined, and harder to notice. It sounds peaceful. It feels elevated. It wears the language of wisdom, and yet beneath it, control quietly survives. There is an emotional comfort in believing you have arrived somewhere, that you are now calm, that you are more aware, that you are conscious in a way you were not before. These identities feel safe because they suggest resolution. They imply that the work is done, that suffering has been transcended, that you now stand on firmer ground than before. But Buddhism has always warned about this exact turn. The ego does not disappear when it is challenged. It adapts, when it can no longer dominate through achievement, blame, or responsibility. It learns to hide inside virtue. Spiritual identity becomes its most subtle refuge. Identifying as calm creates a quiet pressure to remain calm. The moment agitation arises, conflict appears. You are no longer just feeling disturbed. You are failing to live up to who you think you are. This adds a second layer of tension, the disturbance itself and the fear that it contradicts your identity. The same happens with labels like awakened or conscious. These words begin as pointers, not destinations. But when the mind turns them into descriptions of self, they harden. Awareness becomes something to maintain, insight becomes something to protect, and life once again turns into something that must conform. This is a refined prison because it looks like freedom. It feels lighter than old forms of control. There is less obvious striving, less visible anxiety, but underneath there is vigilance, a subtle monitoring of inner states, a quiet effort to stay aligned with an image. The mind begins to divide experience again. Calm is allowed, restlessness is not, presence is good, confusion is bad. Awareness becomes selective. Certain experiences are welcomed, others are subtly pushed away. This selective awareness is not freedom. It is control wearing spiritual language. Buddhism does not ask you to become calm. It asks you to see clearly. Calm may arise. It may also pass. When calm becomes an identity, impermanence becomes a threat again. True clarity does not depend on maintaining a state. It does not collapse when emotions shift. It does not need to defend itself against confusion. Spiritual identity often grows from genuine insight. Something opens, something softens, life feels lighter. The mistake happens when the mind claims ownership of this opening. This is who I am now. Once claimed, it must be defended. The ego re-enters through the back door, not with force, but with refinement. You may notice a subtle resistance to certain emotions. Anger feels embarrassing, fear feels regressive, sadness feels like failure. These reactions are signs that identity has returned. Awareness that is truly free does not exclude anything. It does not need to protect an image of clarity. It allows contraction and expansion alike. When you identify as conscious, you may unconsciously distance yourself from others. There is a sense of seeing more, knowing more. Even without arrogance, separation forms. Compassion subtly weakens because equality is lost. Buddhism consistently dismantles hierarchy, even spiritual hierarchy. There is no final rank, no stable position above life. Everything that arises is conditioned, including insight. When insight is seen as an event rather than a possession, it remains alive. When it becomes an identity, it stagnates. Spiritual identity also interferes with honesty. You may stop admitting confusion. You may hide struggle. You may perform peace instead of allowing disturbance. This performance deepens disconnection. True practice moves in the opposite direction. It becomes simpler, not more impressive, more ordinary, not more special. The Buddha did not teach becoming something. He taught seeing something, seeing suffering, seeing impermanence, seeing non-ownership. When identity forms around spirituality, non-ownership is lost. There is now something to defend, something to maintain, something to lose. This loss is subtle but powerful. The mind once again fears falling back. Regression becomes a threat. The past is judged harshly. The future is monitored. This fear keeps the nervous system slightly tense. Even in meditation, there may be effort to stay aligned. The body senses this immediately. Awareness that is effortless has no posture to maintain. It does not care how it appears. It does not need to be named. Spiritual identity often depends on comparison. I am calmer than before. I am more aware than others. Even subtle comparison reinforces separation. Buddhism cuts comparison at the root by pointing out that there is no fixed self to compare. States arise, states pass, none define you. When identity dissolves, humility appears naturally. Not self-doubt, but openness. You no longer assume you know where someone else is on a path. You no longer assume where you are. This humility brings ease. You stop measuring progress. You stop tracking attainment. Practice becomes a living relationship, not a ladder. Spiritual identity also affects how you respond to difficulty. When hardship arises, there may be confusion. Why is this happening if I am aware? This question reveals an expectation of immunity. Buddhism never promised immunity. It promised understanding. Pain still arises, loss still occurs. The difference is not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of identity around it. When awareness is not owned, difficulty does not contradict anything. It is simply another movement of life. There is also a quiet grief when spiritual identity loosens. The sense of having arrived dissolves. The mind may feel groundless again. This is not failure, it is honesty. Groundlessness is closer to truth than false certainty. It allows learning to continue. The most dangerous aspect of spiritual identity is how convincing it feels. Because it is built from genuine insight, it feels justified. This makes it harder to question. But the question remains simple. Does this identity create tension? Does it exclude experience? Does it need to be protected? If the answer is yes, then it is not freedom. Freedom does not need reinforcement. It does not need a name. It does not need to be remembered. It expresses itself naturally through responsiveness. When identity dissolves, awareness becomes intimate. You are no longer watching life from a position, you are in it. This intimacy allows emotions to move freely. Nothing is out of place, nothing threatens who you are because there is no rigid who to protect. The need to be calm relaxes. Calm may arise. It may not. Either way, awareness remains. The need to be awakened relaxes. Insight may deepen. It may soften. Either way, presence continues. This is not indifference. It is intimacy without ownership. Spiritual identity often brings subtle isolation. You feel separate in your clarity. When it dissolves, connection deepens. You meet others without labels. Compassion becomes simpler. You no longer help from a position. You sit alongside. There is also relief in not having to live up to anything. No role, no title, no image, just responsiveness. This relief allows rest. The mind no longer monitors itself. Sleep comes easier. Thoughts lose urgency. The most radical aspect of Buddhism is not enlightenment. It is the refusal to turn enlightenment into an identity. Nothing is held. Nothing is claimed. Life is allowed to move. When spiritual identity dissolves, what remains is not emptiness in a cold sense, but openness, a quiet availability. You stop asking who you are becoming. You start noticing what is happening. This noticing is alive. It changes. It does not settle into a form, and because it does not settle, it cannot trap you. The refined prison opens quietly. No struggle, no declaration, just a gentle recognition that even this identity is unnecessary. And in that recognition, control fades again, leaving behind something simpler than calm, deeper than awareness, and freer than any name could ever describe. As the grip of spiritual identity loosens and the need to appear calm or awakened begins to dissolve, attention naturally turns toward what has been quietly managed all along. Beneath identities, beneath effort, beneath even silence, emotions continue to move. And here, another deeply conditioned habit reveals itself. Not the need to suppress emotions, but the need to control them, to regulate, to fix, to optimize the inner weather so it matches an idea of how things should feel. There is a subtle tension carried by the belief that emotions must be managed. It sounds reasonable, responsible even. You are taught to regulate anger, reduce anxiety, cultivate calm, maintain balance. But Buddhism quietly asks a different question. What if the need to manage emotions is itself a form of resistance? What if peace does not come from control, but from permission? Emotional management assumes that some emotions are acceptable and others are not. It divides inner life into desired and undesired states. Calm is welcomed, fear is corrected, sadness is treated as a problem, anger is something to overcome. This division creates an internal hierarchy where certain experiences are allowed to stay and others must leave. This hierarchy is not neutral. It shapes how the nervous system responds. When an emotion arises that has been labeled unacceptable, the body tightens, the mind reacts. There is a rush to intervene. This intervention is often well-intended, but it carries a message. You should not be here. Emotions feel this message immediately. They either intensify or retreat underground. Neither response brings peace. Intensification leads to overwhelm. Suppression leads to numbness. Emotional management rarely produces the ease it promises. Buddhism does not teach you to control emotions. It teaches you to understand them. And understanding begins with allowing. Allowing does not mean indulging or acting out. It means letting the emotion exist without interference. This distinction is crucial. Emotional permission is not emotional expression without boundaries. It is emotional acknowledgement without resistance. You let the emotion be felt without needing to justify it, explain it, or change it. When permission replaces management, something unexpected happens. Emotions begin to move on their own. They rise, peak, and pass. Not because you regulated them, but because they were no longer blocked. Emotions are not static objects. They are processes. They are movements of energy shaped by conditions. When you try to manage them, you interrupt that movement. When you allow them, the movement completes. Much emotional suffering comes not from the emotion itself, but from the reaction to it. Fear plus fear of fear, sadness plus judgment of sadness, anger plus shame about anger. Each layer multiplies distress. Buddhism strips away these layers by refusing to add commentary. It does not say, "This emotion is bad." It asks, "What is this experience right now?" This question is not analytical, it is experiential. It invites attention into the body. Where is the emotion felt? How does it move? Does it stay the same or change? This kind of attention is not management. It is presence. And presence has a calming effect that control never achieves. The nervous system responds differently to permission than to regulation. Regulation implies threat. Something must be corrected. Permission implies safety. Nothing is wrong with feeling this. Safety allows relaxation. Relaxation allows movement. Movement allows release. This is why emotional permission is stabilizing. It does not suppress intensity, but it shortens its lifespan. Emotions complete themselves faster when they are not interfered with. Many people fear that allowing emotions will make them stronger or uncontrollable. This fear is based on misunderstanding. Emotions become overwhelming when they are resisted, not when they are allowed. Resistance creates pressure. Pressure builds force. Allowance releases pressure. This does not mean emotions become pleasant. It means they become workable. They no longer dominate the system. Emotional management often comes from a desire to function, to perform, to be appropriate. But performance built on suppression eventually collapses. The cost is paid later through burnout, numbness, or sudden emotional floods. Buddhism takes a longer view. It values integrity over appearance. Integrity means allowing inner life to be honest, even when it is uncomfortable. This honesty creates trust within yourself. You stop fearing your own emotions. When fear of emotion dissolves, emotion loses much of its power. Emotional permission also changes how you relate to others. When you allow your own emotions, you become more tolerant of others. You stop rushing to fix. You stop managing their feelings. This creates deeper connection. People feel safer around you because you are not trying to control the emotional space. There is also humility here. You recognize that emotions are not chosen, they arise. You are not morally superior for feeling calm or inferior for feeling distressed. This removes the moralization of emotion. Calm is not virtue. Distress is not failure. They are experiences. Buddhism treats emotions as teachers, not enemies. Each emotion carries information about conditions. Fear shows vulnerability. Anger shows boundary violation, sadness shows loss, joy shows connection. Managing emotions often ignores this information. It focuses on symptoms rather than causes. Permission allows listening. Listening does not mean obeying. You can feel anger without acting on it. You can feel fear without freezing. The key is not suppression, but awareness. Awareness creates space. Space allows choice. Emotional regulation often tries to create space by force. Emotional permission creates space by acceptance. This difference is subtle but profound. Many modern approaches teach techniques to calm emotions, breathing exercises, reframing thoughts, distraction. These tools can be helpful, but Buddhism cautions against turning them into avoidance strategies. When tools are used to escape feeling, they reinforce fear of emotion. When tools are used to support presence, they align with the Dharma. The Dharma is not against skillful means, it is against denial. Emotional permission also dismantles the idea that peace is a certain emotional state. Peace is not the absence of emotion, it is the absence of resistance. You can feel grief and be at peace. You can feel fear and be grounded. You can feel anger and remain clear. This is deeply liberating. You stop chasing emotional perfection. You stop evaluating each moment based on how it feels. This evaluation itself creates tension. I should feel better. I should be calmer. These thoughts create a gap between experience and expectation. Permission closes the gap. Experience meets itself. This meeting does not require effort. It requires honesty. There is also a deep rest that comes with emotional permission. The constant inner labor of adjustment stops. You are no longer managing yourself all the time. This rest supports sleep. Many people struggle to sleep because they are trying to regulate how they feel before resting. I need to calm down first. This demand creates pressure. When you allow restlessness, sleep often comes naturally. The system no longer fights itself. Emotional permission also softens the inner critic. The critic thrives on regulation. It polices inner states. When permission becomes the norm, the critic loses authority. This does not mean chaos ensues. On the contrary, inner order emerges naturally when fear is removed. Children regulate emotions better when they feel safe. Adults are no different. The Dharma recognizes this. Safety comes from acceptance, not control. Over time, emotional permission reshapes the nervous system. It learns that emotions are not threats, that they do not need to be fixed immediately, that they pass. This learning is embodied, not intellectual. It happens through repeated experiences of allowance. Each time you allow an emotion without interference, you teach the system something new. Gradually, intensity becomes less frightening. Emotions feel less personal. They are seen as movements, not definitions. This perspective prevents emotional burnout. You stop carrying emotions as burdens. You let them flow. There is also compassion here, toward yourself, toward others, toward the human condition. Buddhism does not aim to make you emotionally perfect. It aims to make you emotionally honest. Honesty is lighter than control. As emotional management falls away, something simple remains. Presence, not calm presence, not special presence, just presence. This presence does not care what emotion is present. It is available to all of them. And because it is available, emotions no longer need to shout to be heard. They arrive, they speak, they leave. Peace is not what replaces them. Peace is what remains when nothing is being pushed away. This is the Dharma against emotional management, not a technique, not a method, a permission so complete that the struggle ends on its own. And in that ending, the heart finds a quiet freedom. Not because emotions stopped, but because the war with them did. As the struggle to manage emotions loosens and permission replaces control, a deeper shift begins to take shape. When feelings are no longer treated as problems and inner life is allowed to move freely, attention naturally turns outward again. Not outward in the sense of control or fixing, but outward in a softer way. A quiet curiosity arises about what happens when effort steps aside and life is allowed to move on its own terms. There is a subtle exhaustion that comes from always trying to steer. Even when steering is gentle, it still requires tension. The mind monitors, adjusts, corrects, the body braces. This effort often goes unnoticed because it has become normal. But when emotional permission settles in, the contrast becomes clear. Effort feels heavy, responsiveness feels light. Letting life live you does not mean becoming passive or careless. It means releasing the belief that you must constantly initiate, control, or manage what unfolds. It is the difference between pushing a river and floating with its current while still steering when needed. Non-resistance is often misunderstood as doing nothing. In truth, non-resistance is deeply active. It requires presence, sensitivity, and attunement. Instead of forcing outcomes, you respond to what arises. Instead of imposing plans, you meet conditions. Effort tries to make life conform. Responsiveness listens first. Much of human tension comes from acting before listening. The mind decides what should happen, and then tries to bend reality accordingly. When reality resists, frustration grows. Responsiveness reverses this order. It observes what is happening and responds appropriately. This does not remove choice, it refines it. Choices become contextual rather than habitual. You act because something is needed, not because you are driven by fear or identity. Letting life live you begins with trust, not blind trust, but trust born of repeated observation. You notice that when you stop interfering unnecessarily, many things resolve on their own. Emotions pass, situations shift, insights arise. This trust reduces urgency. The nervous system no longer feels like everything depends on immediate action. Space opens. In that space, wisdom becomes accessible. Effort often comes from anxiety. The fear that if you do not act now, something will go wrong. Responsiveness comes from clarity. You act when action is appropriate, not when fear demands movement. This clarity is not intellectual, it is embodied. You feel when to speak and when to remain silent, when to move and when to wait, when to help and when to step back. Letting life live, you also changes how you relate to time. Effort rushes, responsiveness waits. Effort lives in anticipation. Responsiveness lives in presence. Presence does not eliminate planning. It prevents over-planning. You plan what is useful and release the rest. This shift often brings relief to the body. Muscles soften, breath deepens. There is less internal friction. The system no longer fights itself. Non-resistance also dissolves the idea that you must always know what to do. Not knowing becomes acceptable. Waiting becomes productive. This is deeply countercultural. The world rewards decisiveness and constant action. Buddhism points out that constant action without awareness creates more problems than it solves. Responsiveness values timing. Acting too early can be as harmful as acting too late. Non-resistance allows timing to reveal itself. Letting life live, you also transforms motivation. You no longer act to secure identity or avoid discomfort. You act because something calls for response. This kind of action is quieter and more precise. There is less drama in this way of living, fewer internal debates, fewer justifications. Action arises and completes itself. This does not mean life becomes easy. Challenges still appear. Pain still arises. The difference is that you no longer add resistance on top of difficulty. When difficulty is met with responsiveness, energy is conserved. You deal with what is actually happening rather than fighting what you wish were different. Non-resistance also allows creativity. When you stop forcing outcomes, new possibilities appear. Solutions arise that effort could not produce. Effort narrows perception. Responsiveness widens it. This is especially true in relationships. When you stop trying to manage interactions, you become more attuned. You listen more deeply. You respond rather than react. This responsiveness builds trust. Others feel seen rather than handled. Connection deepens, letting life live. You also affects how you relate to mistakes. Effort tries to prevent all errors. Responsiveness learns from them. Mistakes become feedback rather than failure. You adjust without self-attack. This adaptability is a form of intelligence. It does not require perfection. It requires attention. Non-resistance also changes how you relate to goals. Goals become directions rather than demands. You move toward them without forcing every step. This reduces disappointment. You remain open to detours. You allow life to surprise you. Surprise is no longer a threat. It becomes information. This openness stabilizes the mind more deeply than control ever could. Stability comes from flexibility, not rigidity. Letting life live you also softens the sense of separation. You stop seeing yourself as an isolated actor. You feel part of a larger movement. This sense of belonging reduces loneliness. You are no longer standing against life. You are within it. There is also humility here. You recognize that you do not create life. You participate in it. This recognition removes arrogance and despair at the same time. Arrogance fades because you see how much is not yours to control. Despair fades because you see how much support already exists. Non-resistance also reveals the intelligence of the body. The body knows when to rest, when to move, when to protect, when to open. When you stop overriding it, its signals become clearer. This improves health and well-being. You stop pushing past limits. You stop ignoring fatigue. You respect rhythms. Letting life live you does not mean abandoning discipline. It means aligning discipline with awareness. Discipline becomes responsive rather than punitive. You rest when tired. You act when energized. You stop forcing balance and start living it. This way of being also changes how you experience meaning. Meaning is no longer something you impose. It emerges naturally from engagement. You stop asking, "What should I be doing with my life?" You start noticing what life is asking of you right now. This question is simpler and more honest. Non-resistance also supports deeper rest. At night, the mind no longer reviews every action or plans every future. It trusts that life will continue without supervision. Sleep arrives more easily when effort stands down. There is a quiet joy in letting life live you. Not excitement, but ease. A sense that you do not have to fight your way through existence. This joy is subtle. It does not depend on circumstances. It comes from alignment. Alignment between inner life and outer reality. This alignment does not freeze life. It flows with it. Letting life live, you also deepens compassion. When you are not forcing yourself, you stop forcing others. You allow people to unfold at their own pace. This creates space for authenticity. There is also courage here. The courage to release control. The courage to trust responsiveness. The courage to be moved by life rather than trying to move it constantly. This courage is quiet. It does not announce itself. It shows up as willingness. Willingness to feel. Willingness to wait. Willingness to act when called. Over time, this willingness becomes natural. Effort becomes the exception rather than the rule. Life feels less like a task and more like a conversation. You listen, you respond, you pause. Nothing is forced, nothing is avoided. And in this gentle rhythm, something stabilizes deeply. Not the illusion of control, but a grounded presence that can meet whatever arises. Letting life live you is not a philosophy, it is a lived experience, one that unfolds gradually as resistance dissolves. You do not arrive there, you notice it happening, and when you do, there is a quiet recognition. Life has always been moving. You were never meant to carry it. All that was needed was the willingness to stop pushing, to stop resisting, and to allow the movement that was already there. In that allowance, effort rests, responsiveness remains, and life continues, not against you, not because of you, but through you. As responsiveness replaces effort and life is allowed to move without being pushed, a new misunderstanding often appears. The mind quietly wonders, if I stop controlling, do I stop caring? If I stop gripping outcomes, do I become passive? This question carries fear, because for many people, attachment to results has been the fuel behind action for as long as they can remember. There is an emotional charge around outcomes. They promise safety, validation, meaning. Success reassures, failure threatens. The mind learns early that results define worth. So the idea of renouncing outcomes can feel like giving up on life itself. Buddhism does not ask you to withdraw from action, it asks you to withdraw from ownership of results. This distinction is subtle and often missed. Renouncing outcomes does not mean you stop acting. It means you stop demanding that action guarantee a particular result. You still show up fully, you still care, you still engage, but you release the belief that the future must obey your effort. Attachment to outcomes creates tension before action even begins. You are already living in the future, rehearsing success or fearing failure. The body tightens, the mind narrows. Action becomes a means to an end rather than an expression of presence. When outcomes are renounced, action returns to the present. You do what needs to be done now, not to secure a future identity, but because this moment calls for response. This changes the quality of effort. Effort becomes clean. There is less strain, less desperation, less inner negotiation. You act, then you let the action complete itself. Many people fear that without attachment to outcomes, motivation will disappear. But motivation fueled by fear and desire is unstable. It burns hot and collapses easily. Motivation rooted in care is quieter and more sustainable. Care does not require guarantees. You can care deeply without needing certainty. In fact, attachment to outcomes often distorts care. You start caring about success more than integrity, recognition more than truth. Renouncing outcomes realigns action with values rather than rewards. You act because it is right, appropriate, or needed, not because it promises a particular payoff. This is not passivity, it is clarity. Passivity avoids engagement. Renunciation of outcomes deepens it. You are fully involved, but not entangled. This is especially visible in difficult situations. When outcomes are attached, failure feels personal. Shame arises. Defensiveness follows. When outcomes are released, failure becomes information. You adjust and continue. This allows resilience. You recover faster. You are less afraid to try. You are less devastated by setbacks. Buddhism emphasizes intention over outcome. Intention is where ethical responsibility lives. Outcomes are shaped by countless factors beyond your control. When you focus on intention, you remain grounded. When you fixate on outcomes, anxiety grows. This does not mean outcomes are irrelevant. They provide feedback. They inform learning, but they do not define worth or meaning. Renouncing outcomes also changes how you experience success. Success no longer inflates the ego. It is appreciated without being clung to. Gratitude replaces pride. This keeps success from becoming another burden. You do not fear losing it as much. You enjoy it without anxiety. In relationships, attachment to outcomes often creates pressure. You want conversations to go a certain way. You want others to respond as hoped. When they don't, disappointment arises. Renouncing outcomes allows you to be present with others without agenda. You speak honestly. You listen openly. You allow responses to be what they are. This does not guarantee harmony. It guarantees authenticity, and authenticity is the ground of real connection. Renouncing outcomes also frees creativity. When you are not fixated on results, you explore more freely. You take risks. You follow curiosity. Creativity thrives in openness, not pressure. Outcomes narrow possibilities. Openness expands them. This principle also applies inwardly. When you meditate or reflect with an outcome in mind, tension arises. You try to achieve calm, clarity, insight. This striving interferes with the very states you seek. When you release outcomes, practice becomes a space of exploration rather than performance. Awareness deepens naturally. Renouncing outcomes does not mean you stop setting goals. Goals become directions, not demands. You move toward them while remaining flexible. Flexibility is key. When conditions change, you adapt. You do not cling to plans that no longer fit. This adaptability reduces suffering. You stop fighting reality to protect a desired result. The body responds strongly to outcome attachment. Anticipation tightens muscles. Fear constricts breath. Release softens these patterns. When action is free of outcome fixation, the body moves more naturally. There is less internal resistance. This ease does not make you careless. It makes you precise. You notice more. You respond more accurately. Renouncing outcomes also reduces comparison. When results define worth, comparison is inevitable. Someone else's success threatens your value. Someone else's failure reassures it. When outcomes are released, comparison loses power. You focus on your own response rather than external metrics. This creates peace in environments that are otherwise competitive. You participate without being consumed. Buddhism often uses the image of planting seeds. You plant carefully, you water, you tend, but you do not demand the plant grow faster or differently. You respect natural processes. Renouncing outcomes is trusting the soil. This trust does not mean ignoring consequences, it means accepting uncertainty. Uncertainty becomes tolerable when you are not trying to control it. This tolerance stabilizes the mind. You stop bracing for specific futures. You meet each moment as it arrives. This presence also supports rest. At night, the mind often replays outcomes. Did I succeed? What if it fails? Renouncing outcomes allows the day to end without resolution. Sleep comes more easily when the future is not being managed. Renouncing outcomes also changes how you experience meaning. Meaning is no longer postponed until success. It is found in engagement itself. You stop living for later, you live now. This is deeply fulfilling, not because everything goes well, but because life feels lived. There is also courage here. The courage to act without guarantees. The courage to care without control. This courage grows as you experience that letting go of outcomes does not lead to collapse. It leads to steadiness. You discover that you can handle disappointment, that you can adapt, that you are not as fragile as outcome attachment suggests. This discovery builds confidence that is not dependent on success. Renouncing outcomes also supports compassion. When you are not invested in how things should turn out, you are more available to what is actually happening. You listen better. You help more wisely. You stop imposing solutions. You respond to needs. This responsiveness is the opposite of passivity. It is alive and engaged. The misunderstanding that renunciation equals withdrawal comes from confusing detachment with disengagement. Buddhism teaches detachment from clinging, not from life. You can be deeply involved without being trapped. This freedom changes everything. Work becomes expression. Relationships become meeting. Practice becomes exploration. Nothing is wasted. Even failure has value. Renouncing outcomes also dismantles fear of impermanence. When you no longer need results to last, change becomes less threatening. You enjoy moments fully without trying to freeze them. This enjoyment is lighter. It does not carry anxiety. As this understanding settles, effort and ease find balance. You act wholeheartedly. You release completely. This rhythm is natural. It aligns with how life actually works. You do not push the river. You do not sit on the bank refusing to move. You step into the current and adjust as needed. This is renouncing outcomes without renouncing action. It is not a rule, it is a lived understanding. And when it becomes embodied, something shifts quietly. Life feels less like a test and more like a participation. You are here, you respond, you let go. Nothing extra is required. Action happens, results unfold, peace remains, not because outcomes were controlled, but because they were no longer asked to carry the weight of your happiness. As action continues without clinging to results, something very subtle often remains untouched. Even when effort has softened, even when control has loosened, there can still be a quiet ache in the background. A longing that sounds gentle and reasonable. A wish that feels innocent. The wish for peace. And it is here, in this wish, that restlessness often hides its deepest roots. There is an emotional tenderness around the desire for peace. It comes from exhaustion, from having carried too much for too long, from wanting the mind to finally rest. This desire is not wrong, it is human. But Buddhism looks closely at how this desire operates and what it quietly does to the mind. Wanting peace creates a division. There is the current moment, and there is a better moment imagined somewhere else. There is how things are and how they should be. The mind leans forward, away from what is happening now, toward a future state that promises relief. This leaning itself is tension. Peace becomes an object, something to reach, something to achieve, something to arrive at. And the moment peace becomes a goal, the present moment becomes insufficient. This insufficiency is painful. It turns now into a problem. Restlessness grows not because peace is absent, but because the mind is resisting what is present in the name of peace. Craving peace is still craving. It may wear softer language, but it operates the same way as any desire. It says, "This moment is not enough." And the mind responds by searching, adjusting, correcting. This search keeps the system active. The nervous system stays alert. The mind scans for signs of progress. Am I calmer now? Is this working? Why am I still restless? These questions fuel the very agitation they are trying to resolve. Buddhism points to a simple but difficult truth. Peace cannot be reached by wanting it, because wanting is movement away from peace. Peace is not somewhere else. It is what remains when the urge to be elsewhere stops. This is not a philosophical idea. It is an experiential observation. Each time the mind reaches for peace, notice what happens in the body. There is a tightening, a forward pull, a subtle dissatisfaction. The body knows before the mind understands. Wanting peace often comes with an image, a calm version of yourself, a quiet mind, a steady emotional state. This image becomes a standard. The present moment is measured against it and found lacking. This measurement creates self-judgment. I should be more peaceful. I'm not doing this right. The desire for peace turns into a new form of self-improvement, a new identity to live up to. Peace becomes conditional. You will allow yourself to rest once peace arrives. Until then, effort continues. This postponement is exhausting. It keeps peace always just out of reach, always slightly ahead. The paradox is that peace is already present beneath restlessness, but restlessness covers it because the mind is busy trying to remove restlessness. When restlessness is allowed, without the demand that it go away, it often softens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The fight ends. The extra layer dissolves. Peace is not the absence of disturbance, it is the absence of resistance to disturbance. This understanding changes everything. You stop asking, "How do I get peace?" and start noticing, "What am I resisting right now?" This question turns attention inward, not toward a goal, but toward relationship. How are you relating to this moment? When the relationship softens, peace is revealed. It was never missing. It was obscured by effort. Wanting peace often comes from misunderstanding what peace actually is. Many imagine peace as a constant pleasant state. Buddhism does not define peace this way. Peace is not emotional perfection. It is openness. Openness can include discomfort. It can include sadness. It can include fear. Peace is the willingness to allow these experiences without needing them to disappear. This willingness is not resignation. It is intimacy. You meet experience fully instead of negotiating with it. Craving peace keeps experience at a distance. You tolerate the present only as a means to an end. This prevents full contact. Full contact is what dissolves struggle. The mind often says, "Once I'm peaceful, then I can live." Buddhism replies, "Live now, and peace may show up." Peace is a byproduct, not a product. This is deeply counterintuitive. The mind is trained to pursue, to optimize, to improve. Letting go of pursuit feels like giving up. But what is actually being given up is not peace, but the obstacle to it. There is also fear hidden inside the desire for peace. Fear that without peace, you cannot handle life. Fear that restlessness means failure. This fear adds urgency. It turns peace into an emergency, and emergencies do not create calm. Buddhism teaches patience not as waiting for peace, but as staying with what is. Staying does not mean forcing yourself to endure. It means not abandoning the moment for an imagined better one. This staying stabilizes the mind in a way striving never could. When you stop wanting peace, something softens. The body relaxes slightly, the breath deepens. Not because peace arrived, but because effort paused. This pause is the doorway. Many people have experienced moments of peace unexpectedly, in grief, in exhaustion, in surrender. These moments did not come from trying. They came when trying stopped. Trying to recreate these moments misses the point. The conditions were not special. The absence of resistance was. Peace arrives when the mind is no longer asking for it. This does not mean you should suppress the desire for peace. Suppression is another form of control. Instead, you notice the desire. You feel it. You allow it. Even the desire for peace can be allowed. When allowed, it loosens. When resisted or acted on, it tightens. This is subtle practice. It is not about replacing one desire with another. It is about seeing desire clearly. Seeing desire clearly reveals its movement. It reaches forward. It pulls away from now. Awareness notices this movement without following it. In this noticing, desire loses momentum. Peace is not something awareness produces. It is what awareness uncovers. The craving for peace also shapes how people approach spiritual practice. Practice becomes a means to an end. Meditation is used to fix the mind. Presence is used to eliminate thoughts. This instrumental approach keeps the mind busy. It turns practice into work. When practice is done without wanting peace, it becomes rest. You sit, not to become peaceful, but because sitting is happening. This simplicity allows depth. The mind often resists this simplicity. It wants reassurance, it wants progress, it wants confirmation. Buddhism offers none of these. It offers clarity. Clarity shows that peace is not missing, it is just covered by demand. This realization is not dramatic. It is quiet. It does not announce itself. You may still feel restless, but the restlessness feels less personal, less threatening. It is just another movement. This non-personal quality is key. When you stop taking restlessness as a problem, it stops behaving like one. Peace becomes background rather than foreground. It does not need to be felt to be present. This is why people sometimes feel peace even in chaos. Not because chaos stopped, but because resistance did. Wanting peace prevents peace because it keeps the mind in a state of seeking. Seeking is movement. Peace is stillness. Stillness cannot be reached by movement. This does not mean you must force stillness. It means you stop interrupting it. The interruption is subtle, a thought, a hope, a comparison. Each interruption is small, but together they keep the system active. When interruptions slow, peace becomes obvious. This is not a peak experience, it is a ground. The ground does not require maintenance. Peace is not fragile. Wanting makes it seem fragile. When you stop wanting peace, you discover it was never in danger. This discovery brings relief. Not excitement. Relief. Relief that you do not need to fix yourself. Relief that rest is allowed now. Relief that peace does not depend on your success. This relief deepens rest. The body unwinds. Sleep comes easier when peace is no longer a demand. The mind stops evaluating the moment. Night does not need to be peaceful to allow sleep. It needs permission. When you stop asking for peace, the asking mind rests. And in that rest, peace quietly remains, not as a reward, not as a state, but as the natural absence of struggle. This is the paradox Buddhism points to. The more you chase peace, the further it feels. The moment you stop chasing, you notice it was already here. Not perfect, not permanent, but sufficient. And in that sufficiency, the heart settles, not because life changed, but because the demand for life to change finally ended. As the craving for peace softens and the mind stops leaning toward a better moment somewhere else, a deeper pattern becomes visible beneath the surface. Even without chasing peace, even without striving for calm, there can still be a quiet tightening around how things unfold, a habit of checking, adjusting, correcting, a need to manage details. This habit often goes unnoticed because it feels practical, responsible, even caring. But at its core, it is something simpler and more vulnerable. It is distrust of change. There is an emotional unease tied to impermanence that most people never fully face. Everything changes. Bodies age, feelings shift, plans unravel, relationships evolve. This truth is known intellectually, but emotionally, it can feel threatening. Control steps in as a response. If things can be managed closely enough, maybe change can be slowed, shaped, or softened. Maybe uncertainty can be kept at bay. Control is not born from strength, it is born from fear, specifically the fear that what changes cannot be handled. The fear that if things are allowed to move freely, something precious will be lost, or something painful will arrive unannounced. Micromanagement is how this fear expresses itself in daily life. You manage time tightly so nothing escapes you. You manage people subtly so they stay predictable. You manage yourself harshly so nothing falls apart. Each act of control whispers the same message: I don't trust life to move on its own. Buddhism does not condemn this fear. It recognizes it as human, but it points out the cost. Control requires constant vigilance. The mind must stay alert. The body must stay tense. The nervous system never fully rests. Accepting impermanence does not mean liking change. It means recognizing that change is not a personal failure. It is the nature of life. When this recognition settles, control begins to loosen, not because it is forbidden, but because it becomes unnecessary. Control assumes that stability comes from holding things still. Buddhism shows that true stability comes from the ability to adapt. When you trust impermanence, you trust that you can meet what arises. This trust is not abstract. It is built through experience. Each time something changes and you survive it, the grip of control weakens slightly. Each time you allow uncertainty without rushing to fix it, resilience grows. Micromanaging people often comes from fear of unpredictability. You want others to behave consistently so you can feel safe. When they change, anxiety arises. Control tries to restore familiarity. But people are not static. Expecting them to remain the same is expecting life to stop. This expectation creates conflict and disappointment. Accepting impermanence allows you to meet people as they are now, not as you wish they would remain. This does not remove boundaries, it removes illusion. When you stop trying to control others, relationships breathe, trust deepens, tension eases. You no longer feel responsible for shaping someone else's journey. Micromanaging time comes from a similar fear. Time passes whether you watch it or not. Control tries to slow it by filling every moment, optimizing every hour, planning every future. This constant management creates anxiety around wasted time. Rest feels undeserved. Stillness feels dangerous. Accepting impermanence reframes time. You stop treating it as something to conquer. You treat it as something to move within. Moments are lived rather than managed. This changes how you experience aging, deadlines, and loss. You stop fighting the passage of time and start participating in it. Micromanaging the self is perhaps the most exhausting form of control. Monitoring thoughts, correcting emotions, policing behavior. The inner supervisor never sleeps. This supervisor exists because impermanence feels threatening. If the self changes, who are you? Control tries to stabilize identity by enforcing consistency. Buddhism reveals that identity is already fluid. Trying to freeze it creates suffering. Accepting transience allows identity to soften without collapse. You do not disappear when you change. You evolve. When impermanence is accepted, mistakes lose their power. They are no longer threats to identity. They are moments in motion. This acceptance reduces shame. Shame comes from believing you should have remained a certain way. Impermanence shows that remaining the same was never possible. Control also tries to protect pleasure. When things are good, the mind tightens. It wants the moment to last. It monitors. It anticipates loss. This anticipation prevents full enjoyment. Pleasure becomes fragile. Accepting impermanence allows you to enjoy without clinging. You savor moments knowing they will pass. This does not make them less meaningful, it makes them more vivid. Control also arises around pain. The mind tries to manage discomfort away. It tightens against it. This tension amplifies suffering. Accepting impermanence allows pain to be felt without panic. You know it will change. This knowledge does not eliminate pain, but it reduces fear. Fear is what turns pain into suffering. When impermanence is trusted, you stop needing guarantees. You stop demanding that life stay the same for you to feel safe. Safety becomes internal. It rests in adaptability, not predictability. This internal safety stabilizes the mind deeply. You no longer scan constantly for threats. You respond when something arises instead of anticipating endlessly. Control thrives on anticipation. Acceptance lives in presence. Presence does not eliminate planning. It prevents obsession. You plan what is helpful and release what is not. This release frees energy. You stop carrying the future everywhere with you. Accepting impermanence also changes how you relate to loss. Loss no longer feels like betrayal. It feels like movement. Grief still arises, but it is not complicated by disbelief. This shouldn't have happened. Acceptance allows grief to flow cleanly. Control often delays grief by resisting reality. Acceptance allows healing to begin. This applies to endings of all kinds, jobs, roles, phases of life. Letting go becomes possible when you stop arguing with change. Control argues. Acceptance listens. Micromanagement is exhausting because it assumes you must be everywhere at once. Accepting impermanence allows you to be where you are. You stop trying to hold multiple timelines. You live this moment. This presence calms the nervous system. It signals safety. Impermanence also teaches humility. You see how little remains fixed. This humility softens judgment toward yourself, toward others. Judgment often arises from expecting permanence. You should know better by now. I should be over this. Impermanence dissolves these expectations. You stop rushing yourself. You stop rushing others. This patience is not laziness. It is alignment with reality. Accepting impermanence does not mean you stop caring. It means you care without clinging. You engage without gripping. This engagement is more sustainable. You do not burn out trying to freeze life. Control often disguises itself as responsibility. If I don't manage this, something bad will happen. Accepting impermanence reframes responsibility as responsiveness. You respond when something happens. You do not try to prevent all possible outcomes. This reduces anxiety. Anxiety thrives on imagined futures. Acceptance stays with what is. As impermanence becomes trusted, micromanagement loses its justification. The mind relaxes its grip. You stop correcting small details. You stop rehearsing conversations. You stop replaying moments. Life feels less brittle, more forgiving. There is also a quiet confidence that emerges. Not the confidence of mastery, but the confidence of adaptability. You trust that you can meet change, that you can adjust, that you do not need to control everything to be okay. This confidence is deeply stabilizing. It does not depend on circumstances. Sleep deepens here. The mind no longer reviews every detail of the day or plans every detail of tomorrow. It trusts that life will continue without supervision. Impermanence, once feared, becomes a source of relief. You no longer have to maintain everything. Nothing needs to be held forever. This release lightens the heart. You stop carrying the world. Control as distrust of impermanence dissolves when impermanence is seen clearly and accepted gently, not as a threat, but as a fact of life. When this acceptance settles, micromanagement fades naturally. There is nothing left to defend. What remains is a steady openness, a willingness to meet change, a trust in movement. Life flows, you move with it. Not because you surrendered responsibility, but because you surrendered the illusion that life needed to be held still for you to survive. And in that surrender, something unexpected happens. The mind becomes calmer, the body relaxes, the heart opens. Not because change stopped, but because you stopped fighting it. Impermanence becomes not the enemy of peace, but its foundation. As trust in impermanence settles and the need to hold life still begins to loosen, another layer of control quietly reveals itself. It does not manage time, it does not manage emotions, it manages meaning, it tells stories. It explains who you are, why things happened, where you are going, and what it all says about you. And without realizing it, the mind tightens again, not around events, but around narrative. There is a deep emotional comfort in having a story. Stories create continuity. They turn change into coherence. They give suffering a reason and success a shape. They say, this is who I am. This is why this happened. This is what it means. Without a story, the mind feels exposed. Without explanation, it feels unfinished. Buddhism sees this clearly and quietly refuses to participate. The Dharma does not deny that stories exist. It denies their authority. It points out that the story of me is not a stable truth, but a moving interpretation layered on top of experience. And this interpretation, while useful at times, becomes a form of control when it is treated as reality itself. Narrative control is the attempt to secure identity through meaning. When something happens, the mind rushes to explain it. If the explanation fits the existing self-story, relief follows. If it threatens the story, anxiety arises. This anxiety is not about the event, it is about meaning slipping out of control. The mind wants experience to confirm who it thinks it is. When reality refuses, storytelling intensifies. New chapters are written, old ones are revised. Pain is justified, blame is assigned, victories are claimed. All of this feels natural, but it carries a hidden cost. It traps attention in the past and future. It pulls awareness away from direct experience and into interpretation. Buddhism repeatedly points back to what is happening before the story forms. Sensation before explanation, feeling before identity, action before narrative ownership. This is not anti-intellectual, it is anti-confusion. Stories simplify reality, but reality is not simple. The self-story reduces complexity into something manageable, but what is manageable is rarely what is true. The problem is not that stories exist. The problem is believing they must be finished, coherent, and correct for life to make sense. Unfinished meaning feels uncomfortable. The mind wants closure. It wants a reason. It wants an arc. Buddhism refuses to provide one. Freedom does not come from finding the right story. It comes from seeing that no story can fully capture experience. Narrative control often begins early. You are taught to explain yourself, to justify actions, to define goals. Over time, you learn to see life as a biography in progress. Each event must fit. When something does not fit, tension arises. This shouldn't have happened. This doesn't align with who I am. The mind works overtime to repair the narrative. This repair effort is exhausting. It keeps the mind busy even when nothing is wrong. Buddhism undermines this by refusing to treat the self as a story at all. The self is seen as a process, not a plot. Processes do not need coherence. They move, they change, they do not ask to be summarized. Narratives ask for permanence. Processes accept impermanence. When narrative control loosens, experience becomes lighter. You no longer need to explain every feeling. You no longer need to justify every choice. You no longer need to turn life into something meaningful before it can be lived. This does not make life meaningless. It makes meaning optional. Optional meaning is freeing. You can allow moments to be just moments. You can allow pain to be pain without turning it into a lesson. You can allow joy to be joy without turning it into a definition. Stories often intensify suffering. When something painful happens, the story adds layers. This always happens to me. This proves something is wrong with me. This will ruin everything. The original pain is simple. The narrative multiplies it. Buddhism invites you to see this multiplication clearly. To notice how suffering grows not from experience, but from interpretation. This noticing does not require you to suppress thought. Thoughts will arise, stories will appear. The difference is you stop believing they are necessary. You let the story be incomplete. This incompleteness feels unsettling at first. The mind searches for footing. It wants to know where it stands. Buddhism does not answer. It allows standing to dissolve. This dissolution does not lead to chaos. It leads to presence. When you are not busy narrating, attention returns to what is happening. Breath, sound, sensation, movement. Life feels immediate. Immediate life does not need explanation. Narrative control also shapes how people relate to each other. You assign roles. You decide who someone is based on past chapters. You interact with the story rather than the person. When narrative loosens, relationships become fresh. You meet the person as they are now, not as they were in the story. This openness allows change. It allows forgiveness. It allows surprise. Buddhism emphasizes beginner's mind for this reason. Beginner's mind is not ignorance. It is freedom from narrative certainty. Certainty closes perception. Openness keeps it alive. Stories often hide fear, fear of meaninglessness, fear of randomness, fear that without explanation, life is unstable. Buddhism does not replace stories with better stories. It points to the stability of awareness itself. Awareness does not need meaning to function. It is present whether things make sense or not. This presence is reliable. Stories are not. When narrative control drops, you stop needing your life to make sense in a linear way. You accept contradiction. You accept unfinished chapters. This acceptance reduces inner conflict. You stop arguing with yourself about what something should mean. The mind becomes quieter, not because stories stop, but because they stop being believed. Narrative control also affects how you remember the past. Memory becomes selective. It supports identity. Events are framed to maintain coherence. Letting go of narrative control allows memory to soften. You remember without needing to extract meaning. The past becomes lighter. The future also changes. Instead of projecting a storyline forward, you allow possibility. Plans still exist, but they are not scripts. This reduces fear of deviation. You stop seeing detours as failures. Life becomes less about staying on track and more about staying present. Narratives also create comparison. You compare your story to others. Who is ahead? Who is behind? This comparison fuels dissatisfaction. When stories loosen, comparison loses its foundation. You stop ranking lives. Each moment stands on its own. Buddhism often uses silence, not just to quiet the mind, but to interrupt storytelling. Silence creates a gap where meaning does not immediately form. In that gap, freedom appears. Freedom does not need a reason. Unfinished meaning allows curiosity. Instead of deciding what something means, you remain open. This openness is alive. Narrative control freezes experience. Unfinished meaning keeps it moving. This movement does not feel chaotic. It feels honest. The mind often fears that without a story, motivation will disappear. But motivation rooted in narrative is fragile. Motivation rooted in presence is steady. You act because something needs to be done, not because it fits a storyline. This kind of action is cleaner. It carries less emotional weight. When narrative control dissolves, guilt also changes. You stop rewriting the past endlessly. You acknowledge what happened without turning it into identity. Shame loses fuel. Pride also softens. You stop building identity around achievements. Life becomes less performative. This simplicity supports rest. At night, the mind often reviews the day, adding commentary. When narrative loosens, the day can end without summary. Sleep does not require a conclusion. There is a quiet relief in not needing to know what your life means. You stop carrying that question everywhere. Meaning may arise, it may not. Either way, you live. This is the freedom Buddhism points to. Not freedom through understanding everything, but freedom from needing to. Unfinished meaning allows humility. You accept that life is larger than your explanations. This humility is not small, it is expansive. When narrative control falls away, awareness becomes intimate. You are no longer standing outside your life explaining it. You are inside it, experiencing it. Experience does not ask to be named. This intimacy brings peace not as a story, but as presence. The Dharma does not give you a better narrative. It takes away the need for one, and in that removal, something opens. You no longer have to be someone in particular. You no longer have to make sense. You no longer have to finish the story. Life continues, raw and alive, without needing your explanation. And in that unfinished space, freedom quietly breathes. As the grip of narrative loosens and the need to explain life begins to fade, another deeper craving quietly steps forward. Even without stories, even without fixed meaning, the mind still reaches for something familiar. Closure, an ending, a sense that something has been resolved. When that resolution does not come, discomfort arises, restlessness returns, and it becomes clear that beneath storytelling lives an even more basic habit, the need for answers. There is a deep emotional pull toward resolution. Unanswered questions feel heavy. Unfinished experiences feel unstable. The mind wants to tie things together, to complete the picture, to reach a point where nothing remains open. This desire feels natural, even necessary, but Buddhism looks directly at this impulse and asks something radical. What if the need for closure is not wisdom but fear? Unresolved experience exposes vulnerability. It removes the sense of control that comes from knowing. When there is no answer, no explanation, no emotional conclusion, the mind feels exposed. It does not know where to stand. This groundlessness is often mistaken for danger. So the mind searches. It searches for insight, for understanding, for emotional release. It wants a moment where everything finally clicks into place. And when that moment does not arrive, frustration grows. Buddhism does not promise resolution. It trains something far more subtle, the capacity to remain present without it. This training is not about forcing yourself to tolerate discomfort. It is about seeing how the demand for resolution creates suffering. The pain is not in the unanswered question. It is in the refusal to let the question remain. Closure is comforting because it gives the illusion of stability. It says, this is finished, this is settled, I can move on. But life does not move in clean endings. Experiences overlap. Emotions return, understanding deepens and then dissolves again. The insistence on closure puts you in constant conflict with how life actually works. Buddhism invites a different strength, the courage to stay with what is incomplete, to allow questions to remain open, to let emotions move without demanding they conclude in clarity or peace. This courage is quiet. It does not feel heroic. It feels like staying when everything wants to leave. The mind often believes that unresolved emotions are unhealthy, that you must process everything fully to be free. But processing becomes another form of control when it demands a specific outcome. You sit with an emotion not to finish it, but to allow it. And allowing does not guarantee resolution. It guarantees honesty. Sometimes emotions resolve, sometimes they soften, sometimes they simply change shape, sometimes they return. Buddhism does not judge any of these outcomes. The suffering comes when you decide that an experience should have ended by now. This decision creates pressure. I should be over this. I should understand this by now. I should feel different. These thoughts add a layer of self-judgment that intensifies discomfort. Being unresolved feels like failure in a culture that values answers. But Buddhism reframes this completely. Being unresolved is not failure, it is openness. Openness allows learning to continue. Closure stops inquiry. It freezes understanding. When you accept unresolvedness, curiosity replaces anxiety. You stop demanding certainty and start observing change. This observation does not provide neat conclusions. It provides intimacy with experience. Living without closure requires trust. Trust that you do not need final answers to function. Trust that life can continue without being fully understood. This trust stabilizes the mind in a deeper way than answers ever could. Answers are fragile. New information can undo them. New experiences can contradict them. When identity is built on answers, instability follows. Unresolvedness, paradoxically, is more stable. It does not collapse when something new appears. It has room. This is why Buddhism often responds to deep questions with silence or paradox, not to frustrate, but to interrupt the craving for resolution. The mind wants something to hold on to. The Dharma teaches you how to stand without holding. This standing is not rigid, it is flexible. It adapts as conditions change. The courage to be unresolved also applies to relationships. Many conflicts persist because people want emotional closure, an apology that fully satisfies, an explanation that finally makes sense. Sometimes these things come, sometimes they do not. Waiting for them keeps wounds open. Buddhism does not deny the value of repair. It denies the fantasy that repair always brings closure. You learn to live with unanswered feelings. You learn to carry grief without demanding it transform into wisdom. You learn to love without guarantees. This does not harden the heart, it softens it. You stop bargaining with life. Unresolvedness also affects how you relate to yourself. You stop demanding that your identity makes sense. You allow contradiction. You allow change. You may feel confident one day and unsure the next. Instead of trying to reconcile these states, you let them coexist. This coexistence reduces inner conflict. You stop trying to unify everything. The mind often believes that resolution brings peace. Buddhism shows that peace comes from allowing unresolvedness. Peace is not the result of understanding everything. It is the absence of struggle with not understanding. This is deeply counterintuitive. The mind equates clarity with safety. But clarity is temporary. Uncertainty is constant. Learning to live with uncertainty is more protective than chasing answers. This learning happens gradually. Each time you resist the urge to conclude, something relaxes. Each time you allow a question to remain open, tension softens. You discover that nothing terrible happens when you do not resolve everything. Life continues. You continue. This discovery builds confidence, not the confidence of knowing, but the confidence of being able to not know. This kind of confidence is rare. It is not loud. It does not seek recognition. It feels like steadiness. Unresolvedness also deepens compassion. When you accept that you do not have answers for your own life, you stop demanding them from others. You become more patient with confusion, more tolerant of complexity. This patience improves relationships. You listen without needing to fix. You support without needing to conclude. The courage to be unresolved also changes how you relate to time. You stop rushing toward the future for answers. You stop rewriting the past for clarity. Time becomes less urgent. Moments are allowed to be incomplete. This incompleteness is not emptiness, it is possibility. When closure is not required, creativity expands. You are not limited to a single interpretation. You remain open to discovery. This openness allows wisdom to deepen over time, not as a final insight, but as an evolving understanding. Buddhism does not aim to make you certain. It aims to make you present. Presence does not need closure. Presence meets what is here without demanding it resolve. This is especially important in meditation and contemplation. Many people seek meditation to find answers or emotional release. When these do not come, they feel discouraged. The Dharma invites a different orientation. Sit not to resolve, but to stay. Stay with breath. Stay with sensation. Stay with uncertainty. In staying, something subtle shifts. The need for resolution weakens. You begin to feel at home in not knowing. This does not make life vague, it makes it alive. Certainty deadens experience. Unresolvedness keeps it dynamic. The courage to be unresolved also reduces fear of death and loss. Death is the ultimate unresolved experience. There is no final answer that removes its mystery. When you learn to live without closure in small ways, you build capacity to face larger unknowns. This capacity is not dramatic, it feels like acceptance without resignation. You stop asking life to explain itself to you. You stop asking yourself to be finished. You allow things to remain in motion. This allowance brings rest. The mind no longer needs to tie everything up before resting. Sleep becomes easier when you do not need to settle every question. Night does not ask for answers, it asks for surrender. The courage to be unresolved is not something you achieve. It develops naturally as resistance softens. You notice that openness is not dangerous, that not knowing is survivable. This realization changes your relationship with thought. Thoughts arise. They do not need to conclude. Questions arise. They do not need answers. Emotions arise. They do not need closure. Life continues. Buddhism does not offer certainty. It offers freedom from needing it. And that freedom is quiet, steady, and deeply human. You stop trying to complete yourself. You stop demanding that life resolve. You live with open hands, and in those open hands, experience rests without pressure, unresolved, unfinished, and free. As the courage to remain unresolved grows and the mind learns to stay without answers, something even more intimate begins to loosen. Beneath the need for closure, beneath the need for meaning, there is often a quiet assumption that has gone unquestioned for most of life. The assumption that what happens inside you belongs to you, that thoughts are yours, that emotions are yours, that sensations are owned. When this assumption softens, a deep and unexpected freedom opens. There is a strong emotional reflex to claim experience. A thought appears and the mind says, "my thought." A feeling arises and the body tightens around it as "my emotion." A sensation moves through the body and it becomes "my pain" or "my pleasure." This claiming happens so quickly that it feels natural, almost invisible. But Buddhism asks a question that gently disrupts this reflex. Where is the owner? This question is not philosophical, it is experiential. When you look closely at experience, sensations arise, thoughts appear, emotions move, but ownership is not found in the experience itself. Ownership is added afterward as a mental label. Non-ownership does not deny experience, it does not distance you from life. It simply removes the extra layer of identification that turns experience into burden. When a sensation is labeled as mine, it carries weight. It becomes personal. It demands protection or resistance. When it is simply a sensation, it can be felt without added tension. This shift is subtle but profound. Pain without ownership is still pain, but it is not a problem to be defended against. Pleasure without ownership is still pleasure, but it is not something to cling to. Thoughts are especially revealing in this regard. Thoughts appear spontaneously. You do not choose the next thought. It arises. When you notice this directly, the idea of ownership begins to weaken. If you do not choose thoughts, how can they belong to you in the way you assume? They appear, linger briefly, and dissolve. Claiming them adds responsibility and conflict. This is why people often feel exhausted by their own minds. They believe they must manage, control, or justify thoughts as if they were personal possessions. Non-ownership allows thoughts to pass without supervision. You do not need to agree with them. You do not need to correct them. You do not need to suppress them. They are not yours to manage. Emotions function the same way. An emotion arises due to conditions, body state, memory, environment, history. None of these are chosen in the moment. The emotion appears. Ownership makes it heavy. When you say "my anxiety," the emotion becomes part of identity. It must be fixed. It must be explained. It must be resolved. When anxiety is simply anxiety, it can be felt without becoming who you are. This does not mean detachment or coldness. It means intimacy without identification. Non-ownership does not push experience away. It allows full contact without contraction. There is a fear that if you stop owning experience, you will become disconnected or irresponsible. Buddhism shows the opposite. When you stop owning, you become more responsive, less defensive, more present. Ownership creates a boundary. This is mine. That boundary invites protection. Protection creates tension. Non-ownership dissolves the boundary. Experience moves through without needing defense. This has a direct effect on the nervous system. When experience is not claimed, the body does not brace as much. Breath deepens, muscles soften, there is less internal resistance. Suffering often intensifies when experience is personalized. Why is this happening to me? This question assumes an owner who is being targeted. Non-ownership removes the target. Events happen, sensations arise, thoughts appear. But there is no central entity being attacked or rewarded. This perspective does not remove care. It removes unnecessary suffering. Non-ownership also dissolves pride. When something pleasant arises, the mind often claims it. I am happy. I am calm. This ownership creates fear of loss. Non-ownership allows enjoyment without anxiety. You enjoy the moment fully because you are not trying to keep it. This also softens shame. Shame thrives on ownership. This says something about me. When experience is not owned, shame loses its foundation. Actions still have consequences. Accountability remains. But identity is not fused with experience. Buddhism distinguishes between action and actor. Actions occur, results follow, but there is no permanent owner behind them. This understanding removes the constant need to defend a self-image. Non-ownership also affects memory. Memories arise. They are often treated as evidence of who you are. I did this. This defines me. Non-ownership allows memory without identity attachment. The past becomes lighter. It informs without imprisoning. This also changes how you relate to the future. Anticipation arises, worries appear, plans form. When these are not owned, they do not dominate. You plan without fear. You anticipate without anxiety. Non-ownership does not eliminate preference. Preferences arise, but they are not treated as commands. They do not rule the system. This allows flexibility. When preferences are not met, there is disappointment without devastation. There is also a deep relief in realizing that you do not have to carry your inner life everywhere. Thoughts and feelings can visit without becoming luggage. This relief supports rest. Many people cannot sleep because they are carrying their thoughts as responsibilities. Non-ownership allows the mind to set them down. Thoughts can continue. You simply do not follow them. Non-ownership also changes how you relate to silence. Silence is no longer something to fill. Without ownership, there is no one demanding commentary. Silence becomes comfortable. This comfort extends to solitude. Being alone with your thoughts is less threatening when thoughts are not claimed. You stop fearing your own mind. Non-ownership also brings compassion. When you see that your own experience arises without ownership, you see the same in others. You stop blaming. You stop personalizing. This does not excuse harmful behavior. It contextualizes it. You respond with clarity rather than reactivity. Non-ownership also changes how you relate to the body. Sensations arise: tension, fatigue, pleasure, pain. When the body is treated as me, every sensation feels like a verdict. Non-ownership allows the body to be experienced as process rather than identity. You care for the body without obsessing over it. This reduces health anxiety. You respond to symptoms without panic. Non-ownership also dissolves comparison. When experience is not owned, there is no need to compare inner states. They are calmer than me. I am behind. These comparisons lose meaning. Each experience is just what it is. This perspective also affects spiritual practice. Many people try to own insights. I had an awakening. I am aware. This ownership turns insight into identity. Non-ownership allows insight to arise and pass without being claimed. Practice stays alive. There is also humility here. You stop collecting experiences as achievements. You stop measuring progress through inner states. This keeps practice grounded. Non-ownership does not mean indifference. It means intimacy without possession. You feel deeply, you care deeply, but you do not grip. This griplessness allows emotions to move freely. Fear arises and passes. Joy arises and passes. Nothing needs to be held. This flow aligns with impermanence. Ownership fights impermanence. Non-ownership moves with it. The mind often fears that without ownership, there will be chaos. But chaos comes from conflict, not freedom. Non-ownership reduces conflict because there is no central self to defend. There is also a quiet dignity in this teaching. You do not need to be more than human. You do not need to perfect yourself. You allow experience without claiming it. This allowance creates spaciousness. Spaciousness allows wisdom to function. Wisdom does not need ownership. It responds naturally. Non-ownership also affects how you relate to suffering. When suffering is not owned, it does not define you. You can be with pain without becoming pain. This is deeply liberating. You stop asking, "What does this say about me?" You start asking, "What is happening now?" This shift moves attention from identity to presence. Presence is light. Non-ownership also changes how you speak. You stop saying, "I am anxious," and start noticing anxiety is present. This subtle shift reduces identification. Language matters because it reflects relationship. This does not mean denying emotion. It means not becoming it. Non-ownership also supports forgiveness. When experiences are not owned, resentment softens. You stop carrying events as personal injuries. You allow healing to occur. This does not mean forgetting. It means not binding identity to injury. Non-ownership also dissolves the fear of being overwhelmed. Overwhelm happens when experience is treated as too much for me. Without a central owner, experience is simply happening. The system relaxes. This relaxation allows deeper engagement, not withdrawal. You meet life fully without armor. Non-ownership also brings gratitude. When pleasant experiences are not owned, they are appreciated without fear. You enjoy without clinging. This enjoyment is purer. There is also freedom here from constant self-reference. You stop asking how everything relates to you. Life becomes wider. This widening reduces isolation. You feel part of a larger movement rather than a separate center. Non-ownership also changes how you experience meditation. You stop trying to own stillness. You stop claiming clarity. Meditation becomes simple presence. Thoughts come, thoughts go. Awareness remains. Awareness is not owned. It is not personal. It is shared by all experience. This shared quality dissolves loneliness. You are not alone in awareness. Non-ownership also supports ethical action. When you are not defending an identity, you can respond honestly. You can admit mistakes. You can change course. This honesty is freeing. You stop protecting an image and start caring about impact. Non-ownership also removes the need to constantly narrate experience. Without ownership, there is no need to explain. Life is lived, not described. This simplicity is restful. As this understanding deepens, something quiet but powerful happens. The inner burden lightens. The mind relaxes its grip. The heart opens. Experience continues. Sensations arise. Thoughts